What if everything you see, touch, and hear isn't real? What if the world exists only inside your mind? Stay with me, because this paradox will make you question reality itself. The problem of the external world. There is a quiet question that has haunted philosophy for centuries. A question so simple that most people never pause to consider it, and yet so profound that it can shake the very foundation of reality. It is this: how do we know there is a world outside our minds? At first glance, the answer feels obvious. We look around and see trees, we hear the voices of others, we touch the texture of stone, and we feel the warmth of sunlight. These experiences feel undeniable, more real than anything else. But if we look closely, we notice something strange. Every one of these experiences happens within our consciousness. We do not actually encounter the tree itself. We encounter the image of the tree in our mind. We do not feel the sun directly. We feel the sensation that our brain produces in response. This is the paradox of the external world. We live as though reality surrounds us, solid and unshakable. But what we truly experience is never reality itself. It is always filtered, interpreted, and delivered through the senses. Our eyes, ears, and touch are not windows opening onto the world. They are messengers, carrying signals that the mind shapes into a story. And because of this, we cannot ever step outside of our own experience to check whether the story is accurate. Philosophers like René Descartes were captivated by this dilemma. He asked, what if everything we believe about the world is a dream, or worse, a deception? What if some hidden power, a demon or a machine, feeds us an illusion so convincing that we mistake it for truth? Today, the language may change, but the question lingers. Instead of demons, we wonder about simulations. Instead of dreams, we wonder about virtual realities. Yet the problem remains the same. How do we prove that what we experience is anything more than appearance? One response is realism, the belief that the best explanation for our experiences is that an external world truly exists. The consistency of our lives, the shared experiences with others, the stability of nature, all of these suggest that something outside of us is real. But another response is idealism, the view that reality itself may be mental at its core, that what we call the world is inseparable from mind. Still others admit skepticism, saying that while the external world seems real, we cannot be absolutely certain of it. The paradox does not ask us to stop living or to give up trust in the world. Instead, it invites humility. It reminds us that even our strongest convictions rest on assumptions we cannot fully prove. Every sound, every color, every moment of touch is both a connection and a veil. We believe in the world because it feels real, but the truth is, the world we know best may be the one we never actually touch. And so, the problem of the external world lingers, soft but profound. It is a whisper behind every moment of perception, a reminder that what we see may not be what truly is, and that reality itself might be the greatest mystery of all. Aquinas's paradox. Aquinas's paradox invites us to reflect deeply on the origin of everything. At first glance, it appears as a straightforward theological argument, but beneath its surface lies a profound metaphysical dilemma. At the heart of this paradox is the idea of causation, that every effect must have a cause. Thomas Aquinas reasoned that if everything in the universe has a cause, then we must trace those causes back to a starting point. But what happens when you keep going back, asking, what caused that? And then, what caused that cause? Eventually, we're forced to ask whether there was a first cause, something that itself was not caused by anything else. This is where the paradox begins to take shape. Aquinas argued that there must be a first cause, something uncaused and eternal, that set everything else into motion. He identified this unmoved mover as God, but critics of the argument raise a difficult question. If everything must have a cause, then why doesn't God? Why make an exception? Aquinas responds not by denying the need for causes, but by redefining God as a necessary being, something that exists by its very nature and cannot not exist. In this view, God doesn't require a cause because God's existence is fundamentally different from the contingent things within the universe. Still, this solution opens up another layer of mystery. If the concept of a necessary being is meant to stop the infinite regress of causes, does that truly satisfy the mind, or does it just shift the mystery one step away? Aquinas' paradox doesn't necessarily prove God's existence, but it raises a philosophical tension between our desire for logical consistency and the limits of our understanding. We want every chain of events to have a beginning, but if that beginning lies outside the framework of causation, are we prepared to accept it? This paradox gently unsettles our assumptions. It reminds us that not every question has a simple answer, and not every explanation can be wrapped in a neat, rational bow. Whether one accepts Aquinas' conclusion or not, the paradox he proposes continues to echo through centuries of philosophical thought, inviting us to consider whether the universe is the result of infinite causes, or if it all hinges on one mysterious uncaused cause. Anselm's ontological paradox. Anselm's ontological paradox begins not with the world we see, but with a concept that exists purely in the mind, the idea of God. Anselm proposed that God is that than which nothing greater can be conceived. Even an atheist can understand the idea of such a being, and in understanding it, the idea exists in the mind. But, Anselm argues, something that exists both in the mind and in reality is greater than something that exists only in the mind. So if God exists only in the mind, we could imagine something greater, something that also exists in reality. Therefore, to truly be the greatest conceivable being, God must exist not just in the mind, but also in reality. It's a paradox because it attempts to prove the existence of something purely through the definition of that thing, without physical evidence. Critics like Kant argued that existence is not a property like color or size, and thus cannot be used as proof. Yet Anselm's reasoning still echoes, a quiet ripple challenging the boundaries of thought and reality. Now consider Aquinas' causal paradox, which moves in the opposite direction, from observation to origin. Aquinas looked at the world and saw that everything is caused by something else. Nothing brings itself into being. He argued that this chain of causes cannot go back forever. There must be a first cause, something uncaused that started it all. For Aquinas, that first cause is God. But here lies the paradox. If everything needs a cause, why doesn't God? Aquinas answers that God is a necessary being, one whose essence is to exist and thus requires no cause. But for many, this feels like special pleading. Why is God exempt? Does positing a necessary being really solve the infinite regress? Or does it just push the mystery into a conceptual corner? Together, these two paradoxes, Anselm's logical assent and Aquinas' causal chain, highlight the tension between reason and belief. One argues from the power of definition, the other from the nature of the physical world. Both try to point towards something beyond comprehension, yet they leave us hovering between certainty and doubt. In their quiet, thoughtful way, they invite us to sit with the unknown, to wonder not just about what exists, but why anything exists at all. The Two Gods Paradox. The Two Gods Paradox presents a hauntingly simple yet deeply unsettling dilemma about the nature of divinity and moral authority. Imagine a world where two omnipotent, omniscient, and morally perfect gods exist, but they fundamentally disagree, not on petty details, but on core moral values. One God commands that generosity is the highest virtue. The other claims justice must always take precedence. Both are all-powerful. Both are all-knowing. Both are said to be morally perfect, but they cannot both be right unless morality itself is relative, fluid, or fractured. And if they are not both right, one must be wrong. But how can an all-knowing, morally perfect being ever be wrong? The paradox strikes at the heart of monotheistic comfort. Most religions define God as the singular source of truth, justice, and goodness. But when we imagine two equally divine beings with opposing commands, it forces us to ask, is morality grounded in divine command? Or does it exist independently of any deity? If it's dependent on a God's will, then whose will should be followed when they conflict? And if morality exists outside of them, then even gods are bound by a higher order, one they did not create. This undermines their supposed omnipotence and introduces the idea of a moral law above the divine. The thought experiment doesn't try to claim there are literally two gods, but rather uses this duality to expose a flaw in certain divine command theories of ethics. If goodness is simply whatever God commands, then it becomes arbitrary. If God had said cruelty was good, would it be so? But if we say God commands what is good because it is good, then God is not the source of morality, only its messenger. Either path seems to limit the absolute moral authority we often ascribe to the divine. In the quiet space this paradox creates, we are left with questions more than answers. Could morality exist without God? Could God exist without morality? If two gods can disagree, then perhaps divinity alone is not the compass. Perhaps the true paradox is that the divine, in its vastness, reflects the very contradictions we struggle with in ourselves, between justice and mercy, command and compassion, certainty and doubt. The problem of divine hiddenness. The problem of divine hiddenness is a quiet whisper in the dark corners of theology, a question that doesn't scream, but lingers. If there is a loving, all-powerful God who desires a relationship with humanity, why is he so hidden? Why does he not make his presence unmistakably clear to everyone? For many, this silence is more painful than denial. It's not the loud absence of proof that unsettles them, it's the quiet absence of presence. If God exists and loves us, wouldn't he reveal himself in a way that no one could doubt? Philosopher J.L. Schellenberg framed this paradox around the idea of non-resistant non-belief. There are people, sincere, thoughtful, even open-hearted people, who do not believe in God, not out of rebellion or pride, but simply because they see no clear reason to. They are willing to believe, even wish to believe, but find no sign to hold on to. And if God is truly loving and relational, wouldn't he ensure that such individuals could at least perceive him clearly? The silence begins to look less like mystery and more like abandonment. Some theologians argue that God hides to preserve human freedom, that overwhelming evidence would remove choice, reduce faith to calculation, and strip love of its sincerity. Others say that divine hiddenness allows spiritual growth, that struggle sharpens the soul. But these answers often feel like shadows themselves, philosophical patches placed over an emotional wound. Because the question isn't only intellectual, it's deeply human. It's a child's cry in the night for a father who never comes. It's the quiet ache behind unanswered prayers. It's the hollow space between belief and longing. This paradox doesn't claim God does not exist. It simply asks, if he does, why must we grope in the dark for glimpses? Why is his love so hard to feel for those who are looking hardest? Perhaps the silence is part of a larger pattern we cannot yet see. Or perhaps the divine is not missing at all, but simply different from what we imagined. In that possibility lies both comfort and challenge. The problem of divine hiddenness doesn't answer itself. It invites us to sit in the silence, to listen not just for a voice, but for the meaning within the quiet. The problem of induction. The problem of induction is a quiet crack in the foundation of reason, a whisper that questions the very act of learning from experience. Every day we rely on patterns. The sun has risen every morning, so we expect it to rise tomorrow. Fire has always burned, so we assume it always will. We draw conclusions from the past and project them into the future. This is induction, reasoning from repeated experiences to form general laws. But the paradox arises when we ask, what justifies this leap? Philosopher David Hume famously challenged this comfort. He pointed out that we have no rational proof that the future will resemble the past. We simply assume it will, because it always has. But that reasoning is circular. We believe in the stability of patterns because of past patterns. Yet, that itself is the very thing we're trying to prove. There is no logical bridge that guarantees tomorrow will behave like today. And that realization, once it sinks in, gently unravels the quiet certainty we carry through the world. This doesn't mean we should stop trusting patterns. After all, science, society, and survival all depend on induction. But the problem is that there's no ultimate reason why the universe must continue behaving in a regular, predictable way. Maybe it will, but maybe it won't. And if we cannot justify induction with reason, we are left with something more fragile than logic: habit, expectation, and faith in uniformity. For most of us, the sun rising tomorrow seems beyond doubt. But that belief rests not on absolute logic, but on experience repeating itself enough times to feel like truth. The problem of induction exposes a soft spot in rationality, a place where certainty gives way to assumption. It's not that induction is useless, far from it, but it's not invincible. We walk through life on a bridge of patterns, never fully seeing the foundations below. In this subtle, unsettling way, the paradox reminds us that knowledge, even the kind we feel most sure about, often floats on trust. Not blind trust, but trust built on repetition. And the mind, so eager for control, must learn to live with a quiet humility, that the future is always an open door, no matter how many times it's looked the same before. Molyneux's problem. Molyneux's problem begins with a question that seems simple, almost like a riddle. But it opens a door to deep mysteries about perception, knowledge, and the connection between our senses. The question is this: if a person born blind, who has learned to distinguish a cube from a sphere by touch, suddenly gains the ability to see, would they immediately be able to visually recognize which is which without touching them? In other words, does the knowledge gained by touch transfer directly to vision? The problem was first posed by William Molyneux in a letter to philosopher John Locke in the late 1600s, and Locke included it in his work An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. At its core, this question asks whether the senses are unified or separate, whether our understanding of the world is tied to each sense individually, or whether the mind possesses a deeper, abstract knowledge that bridges them all. If the person could not immediately tell the cube from the sphere by sight alone, it would suggest that sensory information is not automatically integrated, that touch and sight speak different languages. For centuries, this question remained purely philosophical. But in modern times, neuroscience and medical cases have offered partial glimpses into the answer. In some cases, individuals who were blind from birth and later gained vision did struggle to connect what they saw with what they had once felt. The brain seemed to need time, sometimes months, to make the connection between visual shape and tactile shape. This suggests that while the mind may have the capacity for cross-sensory understanding, it doesn't happen instantly. Experience, not just logic, is required for the senses to align. Molyneux's problem lingers because it speaks to something more than sensory perception. It touches on how we build reality. Are our concepts stored as abstract ideas, independent of sight or sound or touch? Or are they deeply tied to the way we encounter the world? When you close your eyes and imagine a tree, are you seeing it, feeling it, or both? The paradox asks whether our knowledge of the world is internal and unified, or fragmented and learned through repeated mappings between the senses. In this way, Molyneux's problem doesn't just challenge scientists or philosophers, it reaches into the quiet spaces of our own experience, asking how we know what we know, and whether we ever truly see with just our eyes. The paradox of self-consciousness. The paradox of self-consciousness is a mirror that reflects itself. It raises a profound question. How can the self be both the observer and the observed? To be self-conscious is to be aware of oneself. But this creates an unusual loop, because in order to observe yourself, you must somehow step outside yourself, yet you are the very thing doing the stepping. It's a strange kind of division within unity. You are one mind, and yet somehow you are both subject and object in that mind. You are the watcher and the watched. This paradox becomes especially puzzling when we try to describe consciousness. When you are aware of a tree, there's a clear boundary. The tree is out there, you are in here. But when you are aware of your own awareness, when you turn attention inward, who is observing and who is being observed? Is there a deeper I behind the I you think you are? And if so, how many layers can this loop contain? Does self-consciousness imply a kind of infinite regression? An I watching the I watching the I? Philosophers have wrestled with this strange, looping quality for centuries. Some say it's what makes human consciousness unique, the ability not just to be, but to know that you are. Others argue that the very concept of a singular, stable self is an illusion, that what we call the self is just a shifting bundle of thoughts, memories, and sensations pretending to have a core. Yet the experience of being me feels so undeniable, so immediate, so real. The paradox lies in this tension between the unity we feel and the fractured nature of how consciousness seems to work. From a psychological view, self-consciousness can even split us, creating anxiety, overthinking, and self-judgment. It gives us the ability to reflect, to grow, to imagine ourselves from another's perspective. But it also opens the door to self-doubt, shame, and confusion. The very thing that makes us human can also be the thing that traps us in ourselves. The mirror doesn't always reflect peace. The paradox of self-consciousness whispers that there may never be a final answer to who or what the self truly is. Because every time we look inward, we use the very tool we're trying to understand. In trying to see ourselves clearly, we may only deepen the mystery, like eyes trying to see themselves without a mirror, or a flame trying to touch its own heat. The problem of the criterion. The problem of the criterion is a quiet yet unsettling philosophical dilemma that hides behind every claim to knowledge. It asks two deceptively simple questions. First, how do we know what we know? And second, by what standard or criterion do we judge something to be true knowledge? But here's the twist. Before you can answer the first question, you need a reliable method. And before you can identify a reliable method, you need to already know some truths to test it against. You are caught in a loop, a circle with no obvious entry point. This paradox, famously articulated by the philosopher Sextus Empiricus and later explored by Roderick Chisholm, exposes a kind of epistemic paralysis. To figure out what counts as knowledge, we need a criterion. But to decide on a good criterion, we must already know what knowledge looks like. It's like trying to build a ruler without already having something to measure it by, or choosing the best flashlight in total darkness. There are typically three responses to this paradox, and none feel entirely comfortable. The first is particularism. Begin with some specific things you believe you know, and then infer the method that made them known. But this feels backward, like justifying your map by saying you're already at the right destination. The second is methodism. Begin with a method, like science or reason, and then determine what counts as knowledge from there. But this too is shaky, because it assumes a method before proving it works. The third option is skepticism. Admit that, since we cannot resolve the loop, perhaps we know nothing for sure at all. The problem of the criterion doesn't scream its importance. It simply hums in the background of all our thinking. It reminds us that no matter how confident we feel, our foundations might be circular. Our beliefs may rest not on certainty, but on habit, faith in reason, or practical necessity. The paradox doesn't ask us to abandon knowledge, but to walk through it more humbly, to see that every claim, no matter how firm, quietly leans on something else. In this way, the problem of the criterion doesn't end thought, it deepens it. It reminds us that knowing isn't just about gathering facts. It's about recognizing the silent architecture that holds those facts together, and asking, with gentle persistence, whether that structure is as stable as it seems. The immediacy paradox. The immediacy paradox whispers from the space between experience and reflection. It points to a strange and subtle tension. The moment we try to grasp something as it happens, truly grasp it, it begins to slip away. Direct experience, in its purest form, is immediate. It's raw, alive, and untouched by analysis. But as soon as we become aware that we're experiencing it, we're no longer fully in it. We've stepped outside, even if just slightly, to observe it. And in that observation, something is lost. This paradox is most often felt in moments of intense presence, watching a sunset, hearing someone say, "I love you," or feeling sudden joy. You want to hold on. You want to recognize the beauty, the intensity, the now-ness of it. But the very act of trying to hold it or name it changes it. Awareness casts a shadow. The moment is no longer purely experienced. It is now observed, analyzed, placed into language or memory. The immediacy is diluted by the mind reaching out to capture what can only be lived. Philosophers, poets, and mystics have circled around this idea for centuries. Zen teachings often speak of the difficulty of being without thinking about being. To truly live in the moment is to stop narrating it, to stop separating yourself from it. But the human mind is relentless. It wants to understand, to frame, to hold. And yet, the moment you say, "This is happiness," you're already one breath removed from simply feeling happy. The paradox challenges our deepest habits. We crave presence, but we reach for it in ways that remove us from it. We try to photograph a memory instead of inhabiting it. We try to describe silence instead of resting in it. And the more urgently we try to stay in the now, the more it becomes then. It is the nature of immediacy to be ungraspable, like trying to hold light in your hand. The immediacy paradox doesn't tell us to stop thinking or to give up reflection. It simply reminds us that life's richest moments are often the ones we don't fully notice until they're gone. That sometimes the only way to truly be present is to stop trying so hard to be. To surrender the need to frame the moment and instead let it pass through us like wind, like light, like time itself. The paradox of the heap. The paradox of the heap, also known as the Soreitz paradox, is a soft-spoken challenge to our everyday thinking, quiet but deeply disorienting. Imagine a single grain of sand. Clearly, it is not a heap. Now add one grain to it, still not a heap. Add another, and another. Each addition seems too small to make a real difference. But at some point, after enough grains have been added, you undeniably have a heap. The paradox asks, when did that transformation occur? At what exact grain did the non-heap become a heap? This puzzle doesn't just apply to sand. It applies to baldness, to aging, to wealth, to love. When does a person go from being poor to being rich? When does someone become old? When does a few kind gestures become love? There's no clear boundary. The change happens gradually, and each tiny step seems harmless, indistinct, and yet the total result is dramatic. This leads to a strange conclusion. If no single small change makes a difference, how do big changes ever happen? Some philosophers have tried to resolve this by suggesting that vague terms like heap have no sharp boundaries, that they are inherently fuzzy. Others argue that we impose false precision on language that was never meant to be exact. But the unease remains. If we accept that there's no precise point of change, do we have to abandon the idea of clear categories altogether? Do all transitions exist on a spectrum so smooth that our labels are more illusion than truth? The paradox of the heap gently pulls at the threads of how we define the world. It reveals that our categories, so often treated as fixed and absolute, are frequently built on shifting sands. We crave certainty. We like to divide the world into boxes, but life doesn't always offer clean lines. Sometimes it offers heaps, vague, gradual, accumulative change that defies easy classification. In this way, the paradox humbles our assumptions. It reminds us that many of our judgments about people, conditions, or identities rest on arbitrary thresholds. And in its quiet way, it invites compassion. Because if no single moment makes someone wise or broken or healed, then perhaps we should be gentler in how we name things and more patient with how things come to be. The paradox of inquiry. The paradox of inquiry, also known as Menno's paradox, begins with a simple question that turns in on itself. How do you search for something when you don't know what it is? If you know what you're looking for, you don't need to search, you already know it. But if you don't know what it is, how will you recognize it when you find it? Either you know, and inquiry is pointless, or you don't know, and inquiry is impossible. This paradox appears in Plato's dialogue Menno, where Socrates challenges the very nature of learning. If knowledge must be recalled or discovered, how does one even begin? The paradox traps us between certainty and ignorance, suggesting that learning itself may be an illusion. If we already know the answer deep down, perhaps from a past life, then inquiry is just remembering. But if we don't, then how do we begin at all? It's a riddle that unsettles the foundation of knowledge. We often assume that questions naturally lead to answers, that the unknown can be chased, caught, and named. But Menno's paradox throws a shadow over that journey. It suggests that we are either chasing what we already hold or wandering blind with no compass. It's the unsettling realization that to ask meaningfully, we must already have some whisper of the answer. Plato, through Socrates, responds with the idea of anamnesis, the notion that the soul knows everything, and learning is just remembering. Whether one accepts this metaphysical answer or not, the paradox remains powerful. Because even in everyday life, we often ask questions without knowing exactly what we're seeking. We feel around the edges of a thought, guided not by clear knowledge, but by intuition, curiosity, or a vague hunger. The paradox of inquiry doesn't end inquiry, it deepens it. It reminds us that the search itself is mysterious, that sometimes we are drawn toward answers not because we understand them, but because something inside us stirs at their possibility. Inquiry, then, becomes not a path from ignorance to knowledge, but a dance between knowing and not knowing, a movement that shapes both question and answer as we go. And in that dance, we learn not just about the world, but about the mind that dares to wonder. Zermelo's paradox. Zermelo's paradox is a quiet disturbance at the foundations of mathematics, one that asks how we can build a complete and consistent system if the tools we use to define it lead us in circles. At its heart is a problem about sets, those simple-sounding collections of things that form the bedrock of modern mathematics. But in trying to describe all sets, we run into something strange. If we try to define a set of all sets, we open the door to contradictions that can't be easily dismissed. Ernst Zermelo introduced the paradox in response to earlier foundational crises, like Russell's paradox, which showed that allowing unrestricted set formation leads to absurdities, like the set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Zermelo's version is more subtle. He asked, how do we select elements from an infinite collection of sets without assuming we already have a method of choice? In trying to formalize set theory, he proposed the axiom of choice, a rule that allows us to choose an element from each set in a collection, even when there's no specific rule for how to choose. But this axiom itself is paradoxical. It feels intuitively true. In some contexts, of course, we can choose something from each set, yet it leads to deeply counterintuitive outcomes, such as the Banach-Tarski paradox, where a sphere can be divided and reassembled into two identical copies of itself. Zermelo's paradox lies in the tension between the need for an axiom that seems innocent and the wildly unintuitive consequences that arise from accepting it. This paradox doesn't unravel mathematics, but it does reveal something profound, that our most basic assumptions about what can be chosen, what can be grouped, what can be defined, are not as stable as they seem. It reminds us that logic itself can be a house of mirrors, where the rules we build can reflect strange and unexpected images back at us. Zermelo's paradox doesn't scream its presence. It hums quietly beneath the structure of formal thought. It invites us to see that mathematics is not just a clean, orderly realm of absolute truth. It is also a space shaped by choices, assumptions, and paradoxes that ripple outward into everything we call knowledge. In that reflection, we see not just numbers and sets, but the human mind wrestling with the infinite. The paradox of belief revision. The paradox of belief. Revision quietly unfolds when we ask, how do we rationally change our minds? On the surface, the process of updating beliefs seems straightforward. We gather new evidence, weigh it against what we already know, and adjust accordingly. But beneath that process lies a strange and subtle dilemma. How can we revise our beliefs without already holding the very beliefs we are trying to update? The paradox begins when we consider that any new piece of information must be evaluated through the lens of our existing beliefs. But what happens when the new information directly contradicts those beliefs? If we fully trust the old belief, we dismiss the new. If we fully trust the new, we discard the old. But real belief revision requires something more delicate, holding both ideas in tension long enough to truly evaluate them. Yet here's the puzzle. If you no longer believe the old view, it's gone. If you don't yet believe the new one, you're stuck. So how do you suspend belief just long enough to revise it? Philosopher Gilbert Harman pointed out that belief revision isn't just about adding new beliefs, but about managing contradictions. If a trusted friend tells you something that conflicts with your worldview, do you reject them, question your worldview, or find a way to harmonize both? The rational mind is expected to be flexible, but this paradox shows that flexibility itself requires a kind of belief in flexibility, a meta-belief that beliefs can be questioned without falling into total doubt. Another layer of the paradox involves coherence. Our minds seek internal consistency. When a new belief disrupts that harmony, we instinctively try to resolve it, often by reshaping the belief to fit our existing framework, rather than allowing the framework to truly shift. In this way, belief revision can become an illusion. We feel like we've changed, but often we've just reworded or reinterpreted. The paradox of belief revision reminds us that changing our minds is not merely an intellectual task. It is emotional, personal, and deeply entangled with identity. Our beliefs are not isolated statements. They are part of who we are. To revise one belief can feel like pulling on a single thread and watching the entire garment unravel. In its quiet way, this paradox doesn't say we can't revise our beliefs. It simply shows us how difficult, delicate, and rare true belief revision really is. It invites us to treat our convictions with both courage and humility, and to see thinking not as a destination, but as an unfolding, where even the act of questioning is shaped by what we already believe. The Specker paradox. The Specker paradox emerges from the eerie edge where logic meets quantum reality, a subtle disruption in the world of yes or no. It began with Swiss mathematician Ernst Specker, who proposed a thought experiment to explore a curious and unsettling truth: that even in systems governed by strict logic, the act of asking a question can change what kind of answer exists. At its heart, the Specker paradox considers a set of propositions that each appear answerable on their own. You can ask, is this statement true or false? And on their own, each one seems to allow a simple answer, yes or no, black or white. But the paradox arises when you try to assign truth values to all of them at once. The structure of the system makes it impossible. No consistent assignment of truth values works across the whole set. You can answer some, but not all, without contradiction. Somehow, the context of the question alters the answer. Specker illustrated this with a fictional game involving a set of boxes, each containing either a gem or nothing. The rules state that only one gem exists, but any two boxes you choose to open will show exactly one gem between them. No matter which two you check, it always looks like the gem is in one of them. But if that's true for every pair, then every box would seem to possibly contain the gem, and yet only one can. The paradox isn't just about probability, it's about the limits of assigning a fixed reality to unseen possibilities. This idea later echoed deeply in quantum mechanics, particularly in the Cauchy-Specker theorem. In quantum systems, certain properties cannot be known together, not just because of measurement limits, but because the properties themselves don't simultaneously exist in definite form until measured. The Specker paradox shows that truth can be contextual. That reality, especially at the quantum level, does not always allow us to assign clear truth values, independent of how we ask the question. In its quiet complexity, the Specker paradox reveals a deeper mystery, that truth, often thought of as stable and objective, may instead be woven into the act of inquiry itself. It invites us to consider a reality not built from static answers, but from unfolding interactions where logic bends and knowing is never separate from asking. The Twin Earth Thought Experiment. The Twin Earth Thought Experiment, proposed by philosopher Hilary Putnam, invites us to reflect on how meaning is shaped, not just by what's in our minds, but by the world around us. Imagine a planet exactly like Earth in every way. It has the same people, the same languages, the same culture. Everything mirrors Earth perfectly, down to the last molecule. But there's one difference. On Twin Earth, what they call water is not H2O. It looks, tastes, and behaves exactly like water, but its chemical structure is XYZ. Now, imagine two individuals, one on Earth, one on Twin Earth, both pointing to a glass of clear liquid and saying, "That's water." From their internal perspective, their thoughts, feelings, and language are identical. Yet the substance they refer to is fundamentally different. The person on Earth refers to H2O. The person on Twin Earth refers to XYZ. This leads to a startling conclusion. Even though their mental states are the same, the meaning of the word water is different. The environment plays a critical role in what our words and thoughts actually refer to. This thought experiment challenges the idea that meaning is purely in the head. Putnam's famous phrase captures the paradox. Meanings just ain't in the head. If two people can be mentally identical but mean different things by the same word, then meaning must involve something outside the mind, something in the world itself. It's a quiet revolution in how we think about language, thought, and reality. The Twin Earth scenario also nudges us toward deeper questions. What does it mean to know something? Is knowledge about internal belief, or about how those beliefs connect to the real world? If you believe you're drinking water, but you're actually drinking XYZ, are you wrong? Even if every experience feels right. And what about identity? Can two people really share the same thought if they live in different realities? In its subtle, almost invisible way, the Twin Earth Thought Experiment shifts the ground beneath our understanding of words and truth. It reminds us that knowledge is not just about what we think, but about where we are. That reality seeps into language, and that the meaning of even the simplest word, like water, may depend not just on the mind, but on the hidden fabric of the world itself. The paradox of fictional truth. The paradox of fictional truth invites us into a strange space, one where truth lives inside lies, and emotions respond to things we know are not real. When we read a novel, watch a film, or hear a made-up story, we often treat the details as true within that story's world. Sherlock Holmes lives at 221B Baker Street. Frodo is from the Shire. These are not real places, and these are not real people. Yet we say such things with confidence, as if they were facts. The paradox asks, how can something be true if it's rooted in what we know is false? At the heart of the puzzle is a conflict between three intuitive beliefs. First, we engage emotionally with fictional stories. We feel sadness when a beloved character dies, or joy when they succeed. Second, in order to genuinely feel those emotions, we must believe that what we're reacting to is real, or at least possible. Third, we also fully know that these stories are fictional and not real at all. But these three beliefs can't all be true at once. If we don't believe the story is real, how can we care so deeply? And if we do believe it's real, then we've suspended a part of what we know. Philosophers have proposed several solutions, but none without cost. Some say we experience a special kind of make-believe emotion, quasi-fear, quasi-sadness. That's not quite the same as real emotion. But this feels wrong to many. The tears we shed at a heartbreaking scene don't feel half real. They feel fully human. Others argue that we temporarily enter a world of imagined truth, where what matters isn't real-world belief, but belief within the story's frame. Still, this doesn't fully resolve the tension. We know it's fiction, yet we treat parts of it as if they carry genuine truth. This paradox reveals how deeply stories affect us, not by fooling us, but by inviting us into a shared illusion, one where truth and falsehood blur into emotional reality. It shows that the mind doesn't need literal belief to be moved, that meaning, beauty, and even truth can emerge from what we knowingly pretend. In the quiet space of fiction, we feel, we learn, and we live, despite knowing none of it ever happened. And that, perhaps, is its own kind of truth. The paradox of foreknowledge. The paradox of foreknowledge is a quiet storm in the realm of time, freedom, and divinity. It begins with a simple yet profound question. If the future is already known, especially by an all-knowing being, can we truly have free will? Imagine a divine mind that sees all events before they happen. If this being knows with certainty that you will eat breakfast tomorrow at 8 a.m., can you choose to skip it? If you can choose otherwise, then the foreknowledge was wrong. If you cannot, then your choice was never free to begin with. At the heart of the paradox is a collision between two deeply held beliefs: that the future is knowable and that human beings have genuine freedom to choose. We want both to be true, but they seem to pull in opposite directions. If a god or any being already knows what you will do tomorrow, then it seems tomorrow's actions are already determined. And if they are determined, then how could you possibly choose otherwise? Some philosophers respond by saying, foreknowledge doesn't cause your actions, it merely observes them in advance. Just as seeing a person walk doesn't cause them to walk, knowing your future doesn't force it. But this doesn't resolve the paradox. It still leaves the unsettling question: if your future is already fully known, is it truly open? Can you change what is already seen as unchangeable? Others suggest that time itself may not be linear in the way we experience it. Maybe past, present, and future all coexist, and divine knowledge exists outside of time entirely. In this view, God doesn't predict the future, God simply sees it all at once. But even here, the problem lingers. If the future already exists in any sense, can we ever do anything differently from what is already there? The paradox of foreknowledge doesn't deny faith or reason, it reveals their fragile balance. It invites us to consider whether freedom lies not in changing the future, but in being the kind of person who freely lives it. Or perhaps it reminds us that knowledge and choice are not opposites, but shadows of a deeper mystery, that time, freedom, and destiny are not linear paths, but interwoven threads in a fabric we have only just begun to feel. The paradox remains, like the future itself, not fully within our grasp, but always reaching toward us. The paradox of the infinite regress. The paradox of the infinite regress is like chasing the end of a hallway that endlessly extends before you, no matter how far you run. It begins with a simple question, why? And follows that question all the way down. Why does something exist? Because of some cause or explanation. But why that cause? And why that one? With each answer comes another why, leading us deeper into a chain of reasons that never ends. The paradox emerges when we ask, can a true explanation rely on an infinite chain, or must it stop somewhere? Philosophers have struggled with this question for centuries. In the realm of knowledge, the regress appears when every belief must be justified by another belief. But that belief too must be justified, and so on, forever. If the chain never ends, how can we ever be sure of anything? If it must end, where does it stop, and why? In metaphysics, the same problem arises with causes. Every effect must have a cause, but if every cause also needs a cause, then we spiral into infinity, with no beginning, no grounding point, no first mover. There are three common responses to this paradox. The first is foundationalism, the idea that some truths or causes are self-evident, needing no justification. These foundational beliefs or causes serve as the bedrock on which the rest of the chain is built. The second is coherentism, which suggests that beliefs can justify each other in a web-like structure rather than a linear chain. The third response is to embrace infinite regress, accepting that some chains have no ultimate beginning, only endless depth. But none of these answers fully dissolves the unease. Foundationalism raises the question: what makes a foundation self-justifying? Coherentism risks circular reasoning. And infinite regress feels unsatisfying. How can something rest on a support that never touches the ground? The paradox of the infinite regress is less about finding an answer and more about recognizing the limits of explanation. It invites us to see that not all questions lead to solid ground. Some trails simply stretch into the horizon, always just beyond reach. In that sense, the paradox isn't a flaw in our reasoning. It's a window into the nature of reason itself. That in some places, understanding doesn't end with certainty, it ends with wonder. The paradox of vagueness. The paradox of vagueness lives in the blurred edges of language and thought, those places where clarity fades, not into confusion, but into quiet uncertainty. It arises from the way we use vague terms in everyday life, words like tall, bald, rich, or old. We use them constantly, confidently, and often without issue. But when pressed to draw a line, to specify exactly when someone becomes tall, or how much hair counts as bald, we hesitate. The boundaries are fuzzy, and that fuzziness gives birth to a paradox. At the heart of the problem lies the Sorites paradox, or the paradox of the heap. If one grain of sand isn't a heap, and adding a single grain doesn't make it one, then how can any number of grains suddenly become a heap? The same logic applies to all vague concepts. If $1 doesn't make someone rich, and one more doesn't change that, then how can a person ever cross from poor to rich? Each individual step seems insignificant, yet the total result is undeniably significant. This creates a dilemma. Either we accept sharp cutoffs, saying, for example, that someone becomes bald exactly when they lose their 537th hair, or we deny that any clear boundary exists, which leads to the strange conclusion that vague concepts can never fully apply. But both options are unsettling. The first feels artificial. The second undermines the precision we often need to make decisions, laws, or moral judgments. Philosophers have proposed various solutions. Some embrace fuzzy logic, where truth comes in degrees rather than absolutes. A person can be somewhat tall or mostly bald. Others argue for epistemicism, that a sharp boundary does exist, we just can't know where it is. But both approaches reveal something deeper, that our language doesn't always mirror reality with clean lines. Often, it reflects the way we live, with nuance, ambiguity, and gradual change. The paradox of vagueness doesn't just haunt logic, it quietly shapes our relationships, our self-image, and our ethics. When do you truly forgive someone? When do you fall out of love? When do you grow old? These questions don't have precise answers, because life itself doesn't always give them. In its soft resistance to clarity, this paradox teaches a kind of philosophical humility. It reminds us that not all truths are binary. Some exist in the twilight, in the slow shift from one state to another, where change is real, even when the line cannot be drawn. The semantic paradox. The semantic paradox is like a riddle the mind tells itself, a sentence that turns language inward until meaning begins to unravel. Its most famous form is the liar paradox, expressed in the simple but deeply unsettling sentence, "This sentence is false." If the sentence is true, then what it says must hold, meaning it's false. But if it's false, then it must not be as it claims, and therefore must be true. It's a loop with no exit, a logical seesaw that never settles. This paradox doesn't arise from fancy ideas or deep mathematics. It comes from ordinary language, something we use every day. And yet, in trying to describe itself, language seems to collapse. The semantic paradox emerges when language refers to its own structure or truth, in a way that traps it in contradiction. It's like holding up a mirror to another mirror and watching reality fold in on itself. Philosophers and logicians have wrestled with this problem for centuries. Some, like Alfred Tarski, proposed strict hierarchies of language, saying that a sentence can't talk about its own truth without moving to a meta level. In this view, truth can only be defined outside the language it's describing. Others explored non-classical logics to handle the contradiction, allowing for sentences that are neither simply true nor false. Still, the paradox resists easy resolution. Every attempt to contain it seems to open a new door into deeper questions. But the semantic paradox is more than a curiosity. It challenges our understanding of meaning, truth, and self-reference. It shows that even the tools we trust most, words, statements, definitions, can twist in ways that reveal their own fragility. And it forces us to ask, what is truth? If some sentences can't be resolved, does that mean truth is limited? Or does it mean our systems of logic need to grow to contain the complexity of language? In its quiet, recursive beauty, the semantic paradox invites us not to despair, but to reflect. It shows that language, while powerful, is not infallible, that in trying to define the world, and ourselves, we sometimes stumble upon the limits of expression itself. And in that stumble, we glimpse the strange edges of understanding, where even meaning begins to question itself. The knowability paradox. The knowability paradox is a quiet crack in the foundation of truth, one that emerges not from what we know, but from what we could know. At its heart lies a deceptively simple claim. All truths are, in principle, knowable. Not that we know them now, or even will know them, but that every truth could, at least theoretically, be known by someone at some time. This sounds hopeful, an affirmation of human reason, a nod to the vast but approachable universe of truth. But when we follow this principle to its logical end, we find something strange, something unsettling. The paradox arises from a classic paper by philosophers Friedrich Fichte and others, who showed that if every truth is knowable, then every truth must actually be known. This is deeply counterintuitive. There are surely truths we'll never know, forgotten moments in history, unknowable minds, facts lost to time. But the argument seems airtight. If all truths are knowable, and we accept that this includes even those truths no one currently knows, then by a certain logical twist, all truths would have to be known right now. That's not just implausible, it feels impossible. So what's going wrong? The issue lies in a subtle shift. We move from saying every truth is knowable to asserting that every truth is known. It's a jump from possibility to actuality that logic surprisingly allows when certain assumptions are in place, particularly about how knowledge and possibility interact. Some try to escape the paradox by denying the formal logic that leads to it. Others refine what it means for something to be knowable, limiting it to truths that are practically discoverable, not just theoretically. The knowability paradox doesn't suggest that truth is unreachable. It suggests that our ideals about knowing everything might collapse under their own weight. It draws attention to the difference between what is true and what is accessible, between the world as it is and the world as we experience it. It humbles the intellect, reminding us that the universe may hold countless truths that will forever remain hidden, not because they don't exist, but because they're beyond the grasp of mind, time, or language. The knowability paradox leaves us in a quiet space, not of despair, but of reverence, a recognition that truth may be infinite, while our knowing is not. And that part of wisdom lies in accepting what may never be fully seen. The paradox of moral luck. The paradox of moral luck unfolds in the quiet spaces between intention and outcome, between what we choose and what fate delivers. It asks a simple but unsettling question: how can we be morally judged for things beyond our control? Imagine two drivers, both reckless, both running red lights with the same disregard for safety. One makes it home without incident. The other strikes and kills a pedestrian. Morally, they acted the same. but society judges one harshly and the other far less so. Why? Because of luck. This is the essence of moral luck. We believe that morality should be about what people intend and choose, not what happens due to chance. And yet, in practice, we hold people more or less accountable based on consequences they didn't choose. We praise success, punish failure, blame outcomes, often ignoring the shared causes beneath them. The paradox lies in our conflicting intuitions. We want to ground morality in free will, but we also feel compelled to respond to results, even when those results involve forces beyond the agent's control. Philosopher Thomas Nagel identified several types of moral luck. Resultant luck, where outcomes shape moral judgment. Circumstantial luck, where people are judged based on the situations they find themselves in. Constitutive luck, where character traits shaped by birth or upbringing influence decisions. And causal luck, where all actions are part of a causal chain we didn't start. Each type pulls at the thread of personal responsibility, asking, if our choices are shaped by luck, how much credit or blame do we truly deserve? Moral luck reveals a deep tension in how we see ourselves. We want to believe in autonomy, in a moral self who chooses rightly or wrongly. But when we look closely, we find that even our choices arise from things we didn't choose. Our genes, our culture, our upbringing, even the timing of a red light. Still, we cling to responsibility because to let go feels like abandoning justice. Yet to hold on too tightly means ignoring how much of life is shaped by chance. The paradox of moral luck doesn't offer easy answers. Instead, it invites humility, a softer judgment, a deeper empathy. It reminds us that beneath the surface of every choice is a world of unseen causes, and that sometimes what separates guilt from innocence is not will but luck. The problem of other minds. The problem of other minds is a quiet and haunting puzzle that sits at the center of human experience. It asks, how do you know that anyone else is conscious? That behind the eyes of your friend, your teacher, your partner, there truly is a mind like yours, full of thoughts, feelings, pain, and joy. You can see their actions, hear their words, watch their expressions, but you cannot feel what they feel. You cannot see their thoughts. You infer, you assume, you believe. But do you know, this paradox touches something deep and unsettling. You only ever directly experience your own mind. Everything else, the feelings of others, their hopes, their sadness, is secondhand, invisible, inferred through behavior. A person may cry, but are they hurting inside? A person may smile, but are they truly happy? We've learned to read these signs since childhood, but the gap remains. You can never enter another's mind. Their consciousness is a private universe, as hidden from you as yours is from them. Philosophers like Descartes emphasize this solipsistic gap, I think, therefore I am. But what about they? Are they thinking too? And how would you know? This leads to the unsettling possibility that the world around you might be filled with bodies that move and speak, but have no inner life. They might be philosophical zombies, perfectly mimicking consciousness without actually experiencing it. It sounds extreme, but we can't disprove it. That's the paradox. Our strongest evidence for other minds is the weakest kind of proof, assumption. Yet we live as though other minds are real. We build love, trust, empathy, and society on this invisible bridge between minds. We treat others as conscious, because to do otherwise would break the human experience. But this trust is not the same as certainty. It is faith, not in the religious sense, but in the raw relational sense. The belief that when someone says, "I'm hurting," they mean it. And that meaning is real, even if we can't see it. The problem of other minds doesn't aim to isolate us. It simply reveals how fragile and miraculous connection truly is. That every shared moment, every look, every word we believe carries emotion, is an act of trust across an unbridgeable gap. And in that gap, perhaps, lies the true beauty of being human. Not that we know others exist, but that we choose to love them as if they surely do. The paradox of the unexpected resurrection. The paradox of the unexpected resurrection is a haunting twist on a familiar theme, a reversal of despair, not through miracle, but through logic, stretched to its breaking point. It begins with a premise of certainty. Someone is told that they will not rise again, that death is final, that resurrection is impossible. They accept this, they believe it, they settle into the quiet of non-existence. But what if that very certainty is what makes the return possible? What if resurrection becomes unexpected only because it was fully ruled out? This paradox plays on the structure of the more famous, unexpected hanging paradox, but replaces punishment with hope, death with life. In the original paradox, a prisoner is told they will be hanged on an unexpected day next week. After reasoning through every possibility and eliminating each day, they conclude the hanging cannot happen at all. Yet it does, and they are surprised. The logic that should have prevented the event ensured it happened with maximum surprise. Now invert that. Suppose a person is told they will not be resurrected. Their fate is sealed, the afterlife denied. They reflect, they reason, they accept. And precisely because they are certain of finality, any return to life would come as a complete surprise, an event beyond prediction. The deeper their conviction in death's permanence, the more paradoxically genuine the surprise of life becomes. Their resurrection, if it occurs, is all the more powerful for being ruled out. But here's the philosophical tension. Does believing resurrection is impossible make it more possible? Can certainty about non-existence invite the unexpected return? Or is the paradox merely a trick of language and time? The more we lean into reason, the more we undermine its predictions. The more we try to calculate surprise, the less surprised we can be. And yet, surprise finds a way. The paradox of the unexpected resurrection forces us to sit with a deeper unease, between knowledge and wonder, finality and possibility. It invites reflection on how the boundaries of death and time might not be as fixed as we assume. Perhaps in some strange twist of logic, the very belief in the end makes space for a new beginning. And in that silent space between expectation and impossibility, something unexplainable stirs, an opening, not for certainty, but for awe. The paradox of mental causation. The paradox of mental causation sits at the uneasy crossroads between mind and matter, thought and action. It begins with something that feels utterly ordinary, your decision to raise your hand. A mental event, a desire, an intention, a conscious thought leads to a physical outcome. But here's the paradox. In a universe seemingly governed entirely by physical laws, where every motion is accounted for by prior physical states, what room is left for the mind to cause anything at all? This dilemma is especially sharp in a materialist worldview where everything that happens in the brain is the result of neurons firing, chemical interactions, and electrical signals. If every physical effect has a sufficient physical cause, then any action your body takes, your hand rising, your voice speaking, can be explained entirely in terms of physics. So where does your intention fit in? If it's not necessary to cause the event, is it just along for the ride, a passive observer watching the machinery move? Yet to deny mental causation is to deny something deeply intuitive, that our thoughts do affect what we do. It feels like your choice mattered, that your reasons, beliefs, and desires led to your action. But if those mental states are either reducible to physical states or epiphenomenal shadows with no causal power, the self we imagine ourselves to be begins to unravel. Philosophers have wrestled with this from many angles. Dualists argue that the mind is distinct from the body, capable of influencing it directly, but this raises the question of how something non-physical could interact with the physical world. Physicalists try to reduce the mind to the brain, but then struggle to preserve the causal relevance of mental states without redundancy. If your decision is just your brain's chemical state, then what work is the mind really doing? The paradox of mental causation doesn't just challenge philosophy, it unsettles identity. It asks whether your conscious self is the driver of your body or merely the voice inside a car that's already moving. It raises questions about free will, responsibility, and meaning. If our thoughts don't cause our actions, then what does? And yet, despite the paradox, we live as if our minds matter, because to do otherwise would break something fundamental. Perhaps the paradox is not a sign of failure, but of mystery, that we stand in the middle of two worlds, mind and matter, not fully understanding how they touch, but feeling deeply that they do. The paradox of pain asymbolia. The paradox of pain. Asymbolia reveals something eerie and unsettling about the way we experience suffering. At its heart lies a rare neurological condition in which people feel pain, but don't mind it. They report the sensation clearly. They can describe the pressure, the burn, the stab. But what's missing is the aversion, the distress, the emotional recoil. They know they are in pain, but it doesn't bother them. And in that strange disconnection, the paradox begins. We tend to think of pain as inherently unpleasant. Pain hurts, that's what defines it. But pain asymbolia fractures this assumption. It shows that pain can be felt without suffering, that the raw data of damage can arrive without triggering the usual cascade of fear, discomfort, or escape. The body reacts, the brain receives the signal, but the mind doesn't care. And this disconnect throws into question everything we assume about the nature of pain itself. What then is pain? Is it the physical sensation, the neurological signal, or is it the emotional response, the urge to withdraw, the suffering, the meaning we give it? If someone can feel the sensation and yet remain calm, even indifferent, have they truly felt pain? Or have they encountered something else entirely? Pain stripped of its symbolic weight. This paradox touches more than just neuroscience. It quietly echoes through questions of consciousness, mind-body dualism, and even ethics. If pain can exist without suffering, does it still warrant moral concern? What does this mean for how we interpret the pain of others, especially those who cannot express it clearly? And how much of our own suffering is shaped not by sensation, but by the meaning we attach to it? Pain asymbolia whispers that suffering is not simply a reflex, it is a construct, layered with emotion, memory, and meaning. It suggests that part of what makes pain painful is not the nerves, but the mind interpreting them. And in this lies a deep and haunting thought, that perhaps, somewhere within us, is a way to feel without fear, to experience pain without drowning in it. The paradox of pain. Asymbolia doesn't deny the reality of pain, it expands our understanding of it. It shows that suffering, like so many aspects of consciousness, is more complex, more fragile, and more mysterious than we ever imagined. The paradox of the external world. The paradox of the external world is a quiet tremor beneath everything we see, hear, and touch. It asks the question most of us never dare to examine too closely. How do we know there's a world outside our minds? You look at a tree, you feel the wind, you hear the hum of distant traffic, but all of these experiences happen inside your consciousness. You never access the world directly, only the internal impressions your senses provide. So how can you be sure there's anything out there at all? Philosophers like Descartes famously asked this very question. For all you know, he said, you could be dreaming, or worse, you could be a disembodied mind, deceived by an evil demon feeding you a perfect illusion of a world that doesn't exist. Today, we might replace the demon with a simulation or a malfunctioning brain, but the puzzle remains the same. All you ever truly have access to are experiences, not the world itself. And here lies the paradox. We live as though the external world is real, utterly real, unquestionably real. We build cities, share stories, make love, suffer loss. And yet, we cannot escape the possibility that it's all an inner projection, that the external world might be an internal construction with no outside source at all. Our senses assure us it's there. Our memories, our language, our relationships depend on it. But when we try to prove it, truly prove it, we find ourselves circling back to our own mind. Some philosophers have tried to resolve the paradox with realism, arguing that the best explanation for our coherent, shared experiences is that a world does exist independently of us. Others embrace idealism, suggesting that what we call the external world is actually mind-dependent from the start. Still others fall into skepticism, admitting that we simply don't, and perhaps can't, know. The paradox of the external world doesn't paralyze us. It doesn't need to. We go on living, but it hums quietly behind our certainty. It reminds us that experience is not the same as reality, and that the world we trust so deeply might be closer to dream than stone. It doesn't ask us to reject the world. It simply asks us to notice that the one thing we never see is whether it's truly there. And in that not seeing, something mysterious remains, the possibility that the world we know best may be the one we never actually touch. The transparency paradox of experience. The transparency paradox of experience begins with an illusion so convincing, we almost never question it. When you look at a red apple, you don't feel like you're having an experience. You feel like you're simply seeing the apple. The redness, the roundness, the shine, it all seems to be out there, in the world, not in you. Your experience feels transparent, as if you're looking through it directly at reality. But here lies the paradox. What you're actually aware of is not the apple itself, but your experience of the apple. And yet, that experience hides itself so completely you forget it's even there. Philosophers describe this as the transparency of experience, the idea that in perception, we're not aware of our perceptions, but only through them. Your mind presents the world to you, but it does so invisibly. The mental paintbrush that creates the scene never leaves a visible stroke. But this raises a strange and subtle contradiction. If we never see the experience itself, how can we ever study or understand it? How do we explore the very thing that, by its nature, conceals itself? This is the transparency paradox. To investigate consciousness, we must become aware of our own awareness. But as soon as we try to turn attention inward, away from the object and toward the act of perceiving, the object vanishes. You can't look at the looking without disrupting it. The apple fades as you try to study your own seeing. Consciousness, like a mirror, reflects everything except itself. This paradox troubles the foundations of philosophy of mind. It raises questions about the very structure of consciousness. If all experience is filtered through mental representation, and those representations remain hidden, how can we ever know what experience truly is? Can we trust what we perceive? Or is it just a seamless illusion stitched together by a brain that hides its seams? The transparency paradox of experience doesn't undermine reality. It deepens our sense of its mystery. It reminds us that the clearest window might still be made of glass, even if we never see it. And that to truly know the mind, we must try to feel the frame through which the world appears, knowing full well that the frame, once noticed, will blur the picture we thought we understood. The problem of the self. The problem of the self is one of the most quietly profound paradoxes in philosophy. It doesn't ask what you are made of or how you function. It asks a deeper, stranger question. Who are you really? You wake up each morning with a name, a body, memories, and a sense that all these things belong to someone, you. But when you try to find that someone, to point to the exact place where the self lives, it slips through your fingers. Like chasing a shadow in a hall of mirrors, the more closely you look, the less there seems to be. Philosophers and mystics alike have long puzzled over the self. Some, like David Hume, found no self at all, just a bundle of sensations, perceptions, and thoughts flashing in and out of awareness, with no solid core behind them. Others, like Descartes, insisted that the self is the one thing we can know. I think, therefore I am. But what exactly is that I? Is it a soul, a mind, a story told by the brain to itself? Here lies the paradox. The self feels like the most intimate, undeniable fact of experience, and yet it resists clear definition. Is the self your memories? But memories change, fade, or can even be implanted. Is it your body? But your body is constantly changing, down to the cells. Is it your thoughts? But thoughts come and go, often without your control. Whatever we try to pin down as the self, body, mind, soul narrative seems either unstable or incomplete. Modern neuroscience adds another layer to the mystery. It shows that many brain functions responsible for self can be disrupted. Split brain patients, dissociative states, and neurological damage all suggest that the self can fracture or dissolve. Yet even in those cases, something inside still asks the question, what's happening to me? That voice, that quiet inner center, remains the greatest mystery of all. The problem of the self is not just academic. It touches every experience we have. Who suffers when we are in pain? Who loves? Who dreams? Who fears? If the self is an illusion, it's an illusion that feels real enough to cry. And if it is real, it is a reality so strange and fluid that no mirror or microscope can contain it. The paradox leaves us with this. The self is both the questioner and the question. The thing that asks, "Who am I?" is the very thing being asked about. And in that eternal loop, we discover something not reducible to science or logic, but perhaps to presence itself, a mystery that watches from behind your eyes and wonders, softly, endlessly, what it means to be you. The paradox of composition. The paradox of composition quietly questions the way we understand objects in the world, how things are built, where one thing ends and another begins, and whether anything truly is what it seems. At its heart lies a deceptively simple question. When do many things become one thing? Take a chair, for example. It's made of legs, a seat, screws, and a backrest. But is the chair something over and above those parts? Or is it just the collection of its parts, arranged chair-wise? Philosophers call this the problem of composition, how smaller parts compose larger wholes. The paradox emerges when we realize that there's no clear, universally accepted rule for when composition occurs. If two atoms exist, do they automatically form a new object, like the pear? What about a pile of sand? When does it become a heap? If you add or remove a single grain, is it still the same object? This links to the Sorites paradox, but with a deeper metaphysical question. What makes something a thing? One response is mereological nihilism, the view that there are no composite objects at all. There are only fundamental particles, and what we call tables, trees, or people are just convenient ways of speaking about arrangements of those particles. In this view, there are no chairs, only atoms arranged chairwise. But this leads to an unsettling thought. The world we live in, the objects we touch, use, and care about, might not really exist as we think they do. On the other hand, universalism claims that any group of things, no matter how random, composes a whole. By this logic, your left shoe and the moon form a new object. Shoe-moon. This seems absurd, yet it follows logically if we allow unrestricted composition. Somewhere between these extremes lies the intuitive middle ground. Only some collections of parts form wholes, but no one can clearly define which ones or why. The paradox of composition doesn't just apply to physical objects. It touches identity, consciousness, society. When do individuals become a group? When do neurons become a mind? When does a pile of experiences become you? In its quiet way, the paradox reminds us that the boundaries we draw around objects, around ideas, around ourselves, are often more fragile than they appear. That what we call whole may be just a story we tell to bring order to the scattered parts. And yet, within that story, we find meaning, coherence, and a sense of unity, no less real, even if composed from mystery. The paradox of concept acquisition. The paradox of concept acquisition asks a deceptively simple question. How do we ever learn a truly new concept? To understand a concept, we must already know something about it. But to know something about it, we must already have the concept. So how can we ever acquire it in the first place? It's like being asked to look up the meaning of a word you've never seen before, in a dictionary written entirely in that same word. Without a foothold, how do you begin? This paradox strikes at the very core of learning. When a child learns what a dog is, they don't do so by being handed a perfect definition. They're shown examples, some furry creature with 4 legs, a tail, and a bark, and through exposure, they begin to form the concept. But even this process requires something prior, the ability to recognize patterns, to associate language with categories, to form abstract groupings. Where did those abilities come from? How did the first concept arise? Philosophers and cognitive scientists have wrestled with this puzzle. One approach suggests we possess innate concepts, pre-built mental structures that act as scaffolding for further learning. These might include basic categories like object, number, agent, or cause. But this raises another question. If some concepts are innate, where did those come from? And how do they evolve or adapt in a world of infinite new experiences? Another view holds that concept acquisition is gradual and approximate. We don't suddenly get a concept. We build it up through layers of analogy, metaphor, and comparison. But this too leans on prior knowledge. To say a platypus is like a duck, but with fur, assumes you already know what ducks and fur are. The paradox remains. You can only learn the unknown by referencing the known. But then, how do you ever expand what you know? The paradox of concept acquisition doesn't deny that we learn. It simply questions how such learning is even possible in a logical sense. It exposes a strange recursion in the mind that to learn anything at all, we must already know something. And that what we call understanding may be less about building from nothing and more about rearranging fragments we've always carried. This paradox humbles our assumptions about knowledge. It reminds us that even the most brilliant insight may be built atop quiet intuitions we never chose, never questioned, never fully grasped. And in that quiet mystery, we discover that learning is not just a transfer of information, but a kind of awakening to what was somehow already there. The paradox of the specious present. The paradox of the specious present unfolds within the delicate illusion of now, the fleeting moment we call the present. We experience time as flowing, and in each moment, we feel that we are existing in the now. But this now is not a mathematical instant. It seems to stretch, however slightly, to contain a bit of the past and a bit of the future. When you hear a melody, you don't just hear isolated notes. You hear the one playing now, remember the one just played, and anticipate the one to come. Your present experience includes a sense of time. This stretch of awareness is called the specious present, the brief, unified span of consciousness that feels like the present. But here lies the paradox. If the present is supposed to be a single, indivisible moment, how can it contain a duration at all? If it does have duration, how is it still present and not part of the past or future? And if it doesn't, how do we explain our seamless experience of motion, continuity, and flow? This paradox challenges the idea that time is made of discrete points, like frames in a film. Our experience doesn't come in frozen slices, it flows. We see movement, hear music, feel change. But each of these requires a span of time to be perceived. You cannot see motion unless you're aware of more than one position. You cannot hear rhythm unless you register multiple beats. So somehow, our awareness of the now must include more than one moment. Some philosophers propose that the specious present is not truly present at all. It's a construction, a mental overlay of past, present, and predicted moments stitched into a coherent whole. Others suggest it reveals something deeper about time itself, that the flow we feel may not be just an illusion of consciousness, but a real, irreducible feature of temporal experience. The paradox of the specious present doesn't aim to confuse. It asks us to notice something we usually ignore, that our sense of now is not a point, but a mysterious thickness of time, a thin slice that somehow contains more than it should. It invites us to consider whether time is something we move through or something our minds create, a living moment that is always stretching just enough to carry meaning. And in that stretch, in that barely there expansion of now, we find the fragile magic of being conscious, of feeling time not as a ticking clock, but as the breath of existence itself, passing, flowing, yet always, somehow, now. The paradox of constitution. The paradox of constitution emerges from the quiet tension between identity and material, between what something is and what it's made of. Imagine a simple sculpture, carefully carved from a block of marble. At one moment, we have two things, the sculpture and the marble. They occupy the same space at the same time, composed of the same matter. But are they the same thing? On one hand, it seems reasonable to say yes. After all, the sculpture just is the marble, shaped a certain way. They share the same atoms, the same location, the same weight. But on the other hand, they seem different. The marble existed before the sculpture. You could destroy the sculpture by reshaping it, and yet the marble would remain. One has artistic value, a name, a creator. The other is simply material. How can two things be so entirely co-located and materially identical, and yet not be identical in kind? This is the essence of the paradox of constitution. It asks how two seemingly distinct objects can share all the same physical properties, and yet be treated as different. The problem intensifies with more familiar examples. Consider a clay statue and the lump of clay it's made from. The statue didn't exist until the clay was shaped. You can squash the statue and still have the clay. But if they were truly the same object, how could one survive without the other? Philosophers have offered various answers. Some say that the clay and the statue are two different objects that happen to share the same matter. This view is called collocation. Others argue that they are the same object seen under different descriptions or sortals, like seeing the same event as both a funeral and a gathering. Still others propose temporal parts theory, where the statue and the clay are stages of one evolving object. But each solution has its own cost, and none resolves the paradox without sacrificing something, be it simplicity, intuition, or logical clarity. The paradox of constitution invites us to rethink how we categorize and relate to the objects in our world. It reminds us that identity is not just about physical makeup, but about meaning, function, and history. That what something is may depend not only on what it's made of, but on how we frame it in time, thought, and purpose. In the quiet space between substance and shape, the paradox lingers, asking how many things might be hiding in plain sight, indistinguishable to the eye, but different in the mind. The paradox of the self-taught learner. The paradox of the self-taught learner unfolds in the silent space between ignorance and knowledge. It asks, how can someone teach themselves something they don't already know? To learn, one must first recognize what they don't know, but that recognition requires some prior knowledge. And to seek understanding, one must already have a sense of what understanding looks like. So how does true self-teaching ever begin? Imagine a person who claims to be completely self-taught. They say they learned a language, a science, a craft, all on their own. But how did they start? How did they know what to search for, what counted as a correct answer, or even which questions to ask? If they had no teacher, no guidance, no exposure, how could they recognize progress? The paradox arises from the circularity at the heart of learning. To move forward, you need a foundation, but to build that foundation on your own seems to require the very tools you're trying to acquire. This is not just a theoretical puzzle. It reflects something deeply human. We admire self-taught individuals for their independence and drive, but we often overlook the quiet scaffolding behind them. Books written by others, patterns observed in the world, language inherited from culture. No one learns in an absolute vacuum. Even the most solitary learner carries unseen influences. Some philosophers resolve the paradox by pointing to innate structures, basic cognitive tools we're born with that allow us to generate and test ideas, recognize patterns, and form abstract concepts. Others argue that trial and error is enough, stumbling in the dark until the outlines of knowledge begin to appear. But even these approaches lean on something already present, a learning instinct, a feedback loop, a desire for coherence, the paradox of the self. Taught learner reminds us that learning is not just the accumulation of facts, but the mysterious ability to bridge the unknown, that even when we teach ourselves, we're never entirely alone. We are guided by instincts, observations, memories, and the invisible hand of prior knowledge we don't fully understand. The paradox doesn't diminish the self-taught spirit, it deepens it. It reveals that true learning often begins not with mastery, but with uncertainty, and that the mind, even when isolated, holds within it the faint echoes of understanding, enough, somehow, to light a path forward. The paradox of qualia. Inversion. The paradox of qualia. Inversion is a quiet crack in the surface of conscious experience, a haunting question that asks, what if my red is your green? Imagine two people who both call stop signs red and grass green. They behave identically, pass every color test, and agree on every shade. But what if, internally, what one sees as red, the other experiences as green, and vice versa? Their external behavior would never reveal it. Their world would look the same on the outside, but feel radically different on the inside. This paradox centers around qualia, the raw, subjective feel of experience, the redness of red, the bitterness of coffee, the ache of loneliness. These aren't just data points, they are what make experience felt rather than observed. But qualia are inherently private. You can't access another person's inner world. You can't step behind their eyes to compare your experience to theirs. And so, the paradox, if everything we know about others is based on external behavior, how can we ever know whether their inner experiences are like ours? Philosophers have long debated whether qualia can be meaningfully studied at all. Some argue that the idea of qualia inversion is incoherent. If there's no way to test the difference, perhaps the difference doesn't exist. Others insist that it reveals a profound limitation in our understanding of consciousness. If our mental lives can differ so dramatically while appearing identical on the outside, then consciousness cannot be fully explained by physical facts alone. This leads to deeper questions. Are qualia reducible to brain states? If two people have identical neural wiring, must their qualia be the same? Or is there an irreducible subjectivity that escapes even the most detailed neuroscience? Could two people's minds be wired identically and yet feel the world in utterly different colors? The paradox of qualia. Inversion doesn't undermine the world, it simply casts a shadow across our certainty. It reminds us that consciousness is not just a thing we observe, but a space we inhabit. A world of color, taste, and feeling that no one else can enter. And in that solitude lies a strange beauty, the realization that the most intimate parts of our experience may forever remain unshared, untested, and unknowably unique. The paradox is not about proving inversion. It's about realizing how little we can ever know about what it feels like to be anyone else, and how, despite sharing the same world, we each may walk through a different sky. The teletransportation paradox. The teletransportation paradox is a thought experiment that quietly dismantles our assumptions about identity, continuity, and what it means to be you. Imagine a futuristic teleportation machine. You step inside, and the machine scans every atom of your body with perfect precision. It transmits that information to a receiver on Mars, where a new body, identical in structure, memory, and appearance, is assembled. The original body is then destroyed. The new one wakes up, remembers stepping into the chamber, and says, "I made it. But here's the paradox. Did you survive? Or did you die in the moment your body was disassembled, replaced by a perfect copy that only thinks it's you?" This puzzle sits at the intersection of physical continuity and psychological continuity. Physically, the person on Mars is made of different atoms. But our bodies already do this. Your cells replace themselves constantly, and you still feel like the same person. Psychologically, the copy remembers everything, feels everything, and continues your goals. But is memory enough? Is continuity of consciousness the same as continuity of self? Now imagine a version of the machine that doesn't destroy the original. You're duplicated, and both you and the copy claim to be you. They love your family, fear your death, and insist on being the real one. But only one can board the spaceship, inherit the property, or kiss your partner. Who is the authentic you? Is identity even something that can be copied, or is it inherently singular? Some philosophers argue that identity is not what matters. What matters is psychological continuity. Others insist that you are more than information. You are a particular physical history, a specific body in time. The paradox forces us to confront a strange possibility, that there may be no single, fixed self, only a flowing process of thoughts and memories arranged in space and time. The teletransportation paradox doesn't just ask about sci-fi technology. It asks whether you are a body, a brain, a story, or something else entirely. It exposes the fragility of personal identity, the way we take for granted the I that wakes up each morning. And in doing so, it leaves us with a deeper, more unsettling question. If perfect continuity can be copied, what, if anything, makes you irreplaceable? The paradox of near identity. The paradox of near identity is a soft fracture in the concept of sameness, a tension that arises when two things are almost, but not quite, identical. It asks, if two entities are so similar that no difference can be detected, are they truly distinct? And if they are distinct, what makes them different? Imagine two objects, identical in every observable way. They have the same size, shape, weight, and composition. You can switch them, compare them, and still find no difference. Now, suppose one has been sitting on your desk for years, while the other is freshly created in a lab, atom for atom. Are they the same object, or just perfect duplicates? And if you can't tell them apart, does the distinction even matter? The paradox deepens when applied to people. Suppose you undergo gradual replacement, one neuron at a time, until every particle in your body has been replaced. You still feel like you, and nothing seems to change. But what if the process happened instantaneously? Would you still be you, or just someone exactly like you? Somewhere between continuity and duplication lies a boundary we cannot clearly define. Near identity also haunts language. When do two performances of a song become the same performance? When do two thoughts, two smiles, two moments become indistinguishably alike, yet still not the same? If two things are functionally, structurally, and behaviorally identical, does identity depend solely on their history, their origin, or is it something more metaphysical, something felt rather than known? Philosophers often reference Leibniz's law. If two things are identical, they share all the same properties. But the paradox of near identity exposes a quiet loophole. What about properties of context, location, or history? If one object was once yours and another never was, are they still the same, even if they are indistinguishable in the present? The paradox of near identity doesn't break reality, it gently dissolves its boundaries. It shows that identity is not always clear-cut, that sameness can be a spectrum, not a switch, and that sometimes what separates one thing from another is not what you see, but the invisible threads of story, memory, and time. In a world of near duplicates, of cloned sheep, digital replicas, and repeating thoughts, this paradox invites us to ask what makes anything this and not that, and what makes you more than just a near you. The explanatory gap paradox. The explanatory gap paradox lies at the heart of consciousness, a silent void between what the brain does and what the mind feels. It asks, how can physical processes in the brain give rise to subjective experience? How does firing neurons, moving ions, or shifting electrical patterns produce the feeling of pain, the taste of cinnamon, or the redness of a sunset? We can describe the mechanics in astonishing detail, yet the leap from matter to mind remains unbridgeable. This is the gap we cannot cross. The paradox is simple but profound. We can explain how the brain works, but not why it feels like something to be that brain. Imagine a scientist who knows everything there is to know about the neural basis of vision, but has been blind from birth. Would all that knowledge allow her to know what red looks like? If not, then no amount of physical explanation seems to account for the quality of experience, what philosophers call qualia. This isn't a problem of missing information, it's a problem of missing connection. Physical explanations operate in the third person, observable, measurable, repeatable. But consciousness is first person. It's private, felt, irreducibly internal. And no description of molecules or mechanisms seems to contain the redness of red or the ache of sorrow. That's the paradox. We can point to the brain region activated, name the neurotransmitters involved, and trace the signal. But we still haven't explained why it feels like this from the inside. Some argue that the explanatory gap is only temporary, a sign of our current ignorance, that once science advances far enough, the mystery will dissolve. Others believe the gap is fundamental, a sign that consciousness cannot be reduced to the physical, that it belongs to a different domain of reality altogether. Either way, the paradox won't go away. It continues to haunt every conversation about the mind, whispering that behind the language of science is an experience science cannot fully speak to. And yet, it is experience, not neurons, not structures, that makes life real to us. The explanatory gap. Paradox doesn't tell us what consciousness is. It tells us what it isn't. It isn't a machine, a formula, or a diagram. It's a fire we can't touch, a presence we can't dissect. And in its quiet resistance to explanation, it reminds us that the deepest truths may not always be solved, but only deeply, endlessly felt. The inverted earth paradox. The inverted earth paradox is a strange and subtle twist on perception, identity, and meaning. A thought experiment that asks, if your environment slowly changes while your brain is adjusted to match it, do you notice the change? Or more hauntingly, do you change along with it? Imagine this. One morning, without your knowledge, you're transported to a planet that looks exactly like Earth in every way, but with one key difference. All the colors are inverted. Grass is red. The sky is yellow. Lemons are purple. But here's the catch. Your brain is altered simultaneously so that you perceive these inverted colors as the correct ones. You see the red grass and experience it as green. You see the yellow sky and experience it as blue. To you, nothing appears different. Now here's where the paradox deepens. Suppose your brain gradually reverts to its original state, one neuron at a time. Each day, you're ever so slightly less adapted to inverted Earth. You start to see the colors as they are, inverted, but you still call them by your old names. You see what is literally red, but still call it green, because that's what grass is supposed to be. Your internal associations, language, habit, memory, no longer align with raw sensation. So the question becomes, has your concept of color changed, or has the world? This thought experiment, proposed by philosopher Hilary Putnam, pushes the boundaries of how meaning works. It suggests that what we mean by a word like green isn't fixed by what's in our minds alone. It's also tied to the external world. If both your perception and your environment shift together, your words and thoughts may still seem coherent, but they no longer point to the same things. This challenges the idea that mental content is entirely internal. The paradox reveals a deeper instability in how we construct knowledge. If meaning depends on both the mind and the world, then radical environmental change, especially one that's mirrored in the brain, can create a gap we're never aware of. We think we're referring to the same world, but the referent has quietly shifted beneath our feet. The inverted Earth paradox doesn't just question color, it questions identity. Who are you when your perception stays stable, but the world changes? What anchors your beliefs when both your senses and your surroundings deceive you with perfect harmony? The paradox leaves us with an eerie realization. The world we trust may not be the world as it is, but a delicate dance between mind and matter, each one quietly shaping the meaning of the other. The infinite mirror. Paradox. The infinite mirror. Paradox is a haunting reflection of reflection itself. A paradox not just of vision, but of identity, awareness, and recursion. It begins with a familiar image. Two mirrors facing each other, reflecting endlessly. Between them, a corridor of light and copies, stretching into apparent infinity. Each image is a reflection of a reflection, growing smaller, more distant, but never disappearing entirely. You see yourself, and behind that self, another self, and another, each one echoing the last. But which one is you? This is the heart of the paradox. If every reflection is based on the previous one, but none is the original, where is the real self in the chain? If each image is shaped by the one before it, and there's no independent anchor, does the series ever truly begin? Or is it just an endless regress of appearances, none more authentic than the last? The infinite mirror paradox becomes even more profound when turned inward, toward consciousness. When you reflect on your own thoughts, you become aware of being aware, and then aware of that awareness. A thought, watching a thought, watching a thought. Like mirrors facing inward, the mind doubles back on itself, seemingly without end. But just as with the optical mirror, there's a problem. Where is the original observer? Is there a core self watching from behind the last reflection? Or is the self just the looping illusion of endless inner mirrors? In metaphysics and philosophy of mind, this touches on self-reference and the hard problem of consciousness. We assume there is a stable I at the center of all awareness. But the paradox suggests that what we call the self may be nothing more than layers of reflection, a feedback loop with no original input. The more we look for the source, the deeper into the corridor we fall. And in aesthetics, the infinite mirror evokes questions about meaning and repetition. If each copy mirrors a copy, what remains of authenticity? At what point does reflection become distortion? The infinite mirror paradox does not offer a solution. It offers a stillness, an image of infinite selves watching each other, endlessly, silently, without resolution. It reminds us that perception, identity, and consciousness may not be grounded in fixed truths, but in the illusion of continuity, and that perhaps, at the center of the corridor, there is nothing at all, just the echo of a gaze turned inward forever. The deceptive evidence paradox. The deceptive evidence paradox strikes at the fragile trust between belief and truth. It asks, what happens when the very evidence that convinces you of something true is in fact false? Imagine you hold a belief that turns out to be correct, but the reasons you used to justify it were flawed, misleading, or based on error. Did you know the truth, or did you simply stumble into it by accident? Consider this example. You believe your friend is at the cafe because you saw them walking in that direction an hour ago. But unbeknownst to you, what you saw was someone else who looked identical. Still, by coincidence, your friend is at the cafe. Your belief was true, and you were confident, but your evidence was wrong. So did you really know it? Or did your mind simply get lucky? This is the core of the paradox. We often define knowledge as justified true belief. But in cases like these, called Gettier cases, the justification is faulty, even though the belief turns out to be true. This breaks the neat formula. You had a belief, you had a reason, and it was true, but the reason was deceptive. So is it knowledge, or something else masquerading as it? The deceptive evidence paradox raises uncomfortable questions about the foundation of our beliefs. If your reasons can be wrong and your conclusions still right, how much confidence can you place in your own reasoning? And how many of the beliefs you hold might rest on evidence that only appears sound? In a world filled with misinformation, coincidence, and cognitive bias, the line between knowing and guessing becomes harder to see. Philosophers have tried to repair the definition of knowledge by adding conditions, like requiring that there be no defeaters to your justification. But each fix seems to raise new questions. How can we know what we don't know? How can we ensure that the evidence we use isn't secretly undermining our beliefs? The deceptive evidence paradox humbles the intellect. It reminds us that truth can arrive wearing a mask, and that certainty is often thinner than we'd like to believe. It asks us to tread carefully with our conclusions, to recognize that even a correct belief can be the product of error, luck, or illusion. In the quiet space it opens, the paradox invites a deeper form of wisdom, not just the search for truth, but the courage to question even the paths that lead us there. The self-referential belief paradox. The self-referential belief. Paradox is a loop of thought that quietly unravels itself, an idea that turns back on the mind that holds it. It asks, what happens when a belief refers to itself in a way that destabilizes its own truth? Imagine someone sincerely believes, none of my beliefs are true. But if that belief is also one of their beliefs, then it, too, must be false. Which means, some of their beliefs must be true. But if that's the case, then the original belief is false after all. The mind ties itself in a logical knot. This paradox arises whenever a belief refers to its own structure in a way that undermines or contradicts itself. It's like the liar paradox of belief rather than language. This sentence is false becomes, this belief is false. But unlike logical puzzles, beliefs are lived. They shape perception, behavior, identity. So when a belief turns on itself, it doesn't just confuse logic, it disturbs the very ground of mental coherence. Consider another example. Someone believes, I shouldn't trust beliefs formed without evidence, but they cannot produce evidence for that belief. It's a meta-belief, taken on faith. If they hold it sincerely, they should discard it, because it lacks the very justification it demands. But doing so would allow in beliefs without evidence precisely what they were trying to avoid. So they're stuck. Either violate their own standard or believe something that tells them not to believe itself. The self-referential belief. Paradox reveals how certain forms of skepticism collapse into contradiction. Extreme doubt, when turned inward, doubts even itself. But blind conviction, too, can implode when it demands unquestioning belief, including in itself. The paradox doesn't just live in philosophy, it echoes through real moments of crisis, when people question their values, their certainty, their frameworks for understanding the world. So what's the resolution? Some say it's to adopt a kind of quiet humility, recognizing that no belief system can be fully self-justifying, and that coherence is a balance, not a perfect circle. Others build hierarchical systems of belief, separating foundational beliefs from those built on them. But even then, the whisper of the paradox remains. Can you believe something that undermines its own right to be believed? In its endless loop, the self-referential belief paradox reminds us that thought is not a perfect machine, but a living, reflective mirror. And sometimes, when the mind looks too deeply into itself, it sees not certainty, but the haunting shimmer of infinite self-doubt. The paradox of memory, erasure. The paradox of memory. Erasure is a haunting thought experiment that probes the very fabric of identity, continuity, and meaning. It asks, if you erase a memory, does the event still shape who you are? And deeper still, if you forget a part of your life entirely, is it as though it never happened at all? Imagine undergoing a procedure that removes a painful memory, say, the memory of a betrayal, a loss, or a traumatic event. Afterward, you no longer recall what happened. You don't feel the same pain, or even remember that you ever did. You live on, perhaps freer, lighter. But are you still you? If that memory shaped your personality, your choices, your worldview, and it's gone, then how much of the person you were before remains? The paradox emerges from the tension between memory and identity. On one hand, we believe our memories are central to who we are. They form the story of our lives, the continuity that links past to present. But on the other hand, we can and do forget things all the time. We lose childhood memories, forget names, faces, even entire years, and yet we still feel like ourselves. So where's the line? When does forgetting become losing oneself? Now imagine someone who has every memory erased, but retains their skills, instincts, and emotions. They can still play piano, feel anxiety around certain places, or hesitate to trust, even though they don't know why. The experiences are gone, but their traces remain. Has the past been erased or merely hidden? And if it still shapes behavior, does memory even need to be conscious to define us? This paradox becomes especially poignant in the context of trauma, grief, or guilt. Many people long to forget what hurts. But if the pain has shaped their growth, their empathy, their choices, what gets erased along with the memory? Can one delete the sorrow without also losing the strength it forged? The paradox of memory. Erasure challenges the idea that forgetting is freedom. It asks whether erasing the past truly liberates us, or whether it quietly unravels the thread of selfhood. It reveals that memory is not just about recall, it's about meaning. And when that meaning disappears, so too may the depth of who we are. In the quiet space left behind by a vanished memory, we are forced to ask, if you no longer remember the road you've walked, can you still say you're the one who walked it? The continuity paradox. The continuity paradox quietly unsettles our deepest assumptions about identity, change, and persistence. It asks, how can something remain the same if every part of it changes? It appears in the classic Ship of Theseus scenario. If you replace each plank of a wooden ship one by one until none of the original material remains, is it still the same ship? And if you gather the discarded planks and reassemble them, which is the real one, the restored original, or the continuously maintained copy? This paradox strikes at the heart of what it means for something or someone to persist through time. You too are constantly changing. Cells die and regenerate. Thoughts evolve. Memories fade. Over the years, nearly every physical and mental component of your being has shifted. And yet, you still say, I am the same person. But what anchors that identity? Is it continuity of matter? Continuity of memory? Or just a feeling? The paradox deepens when applied to consciousness. If your thoughts, personality, and memories shift slowly over time, at what point do you become someone else? Is there a sharp line, an exact moment, when the old you vanishes and a new one takes over? Or is identity more like a river, always moving, yet somehow stable in form? One response is to embrace the idea that continuity is a matter of degrees, not absolutes. That identity is not fixed, but fluid, an evolving process rather than a static object. But this too is unsettling. If the self is a process, what keeps that process yours? If everything can change without breaking identity, is there anything essential at all? The continuity paradox doesn't offer easy answers. It exposes the fragility of our belief in sameness over time. It whispers that the self you are now is not the self you were, nor the one you will be, but something in between. A thread woven from change, held together by habit, memory, and narrative. And yet, in that very tension, lies something deeply human. We are not static beings, we are stories in motion. Continuity is not the absence of change, but the grace with which we carry change forward. And perhaps the real paradox is this, that what stays the same in us is our endless capacity to become something new. The paradox of simulated knowledge. The paradox of simulated knowledge asks a deceptively profound question. If knowledge is acquired within a perfectly simulated world, is it still knowledge? Imagine a person living inside a sophisticated virtual reality, a simulation so flawless that they never suspect it's not real. They learn the rules of their world, study its physics, its languages, its history. They develop theories, make discoveries, build technology, all consistent with the environment they inhabit. But what they don't know is that the world they're learning about isn't real in the traditional sense. It's a fabrication, a program, an illusion. The paradox begins here. Can knowledge be true if the world it's based on is false? If you master simulated physics, are you gaining knowledge or just internalizing the rules of a game? If you become an expert in simulated chemistry or geography, are you learning real facts or merely facts about a fictional world? This leads to a deeper tension. Knowledge is typically defined as justified true belief. But in a simulation, the justification may be sound within the world, while the underlying truths are not. If your simulated sun rises and sets due to programmed cycles rather than actual celestial mechanics, are your explanations false, even if they perfectly predict future outcomes. The paradox is that someone can be epistemically responsible, curious, logical, evidence-driven, and still be wrong in the deepest possible way. This problem becomes even more disorienting when you consider the possibility that we might be in such a simulation. If everything we know about the universe is mediated through perception, and perception can be simulated, then how can we ever know whether our knowledge corresponds to an actual reality? Is all of science just the study of the rules of the simulation, accurate within a framework, but ultimately detached from the true nature of whatever lies outside? Some philosophers argue that knowledge doesn't require access to ultimate reality, just internal coherence and predictive power within a system. In this view, simulated knowledge is still real knowledge, but only relative to the system. Others insist that such knowledge is inherently limited, informative, perhaps, but never truthful in the deepest ontological sense. The paradox of simulated knowledge doesn't just question what we know, it questions the ground on which knowledge stands. It reminds us that truth may be inseparable from context, and that even the clearest understanding might be rooted in illusion. And yet, the paradox also reveals something hopeful, that the human mind, even within an artificial world, seeks patterns, questions, assumptions, and reaches beyond appearances. Maybe what defines knowledge is not just the world we study, but the mind that dares to study it at all. The paradox of non-being. The paradox of non-being is one of philosophy's oldest and most enigmatic riddles. It quietly asks, how can we meaningfully speak of something that does not exist? To even talk about nothing, to describe it, define it, or imagine it, we must treat it as something. And in doing so, we contradict the very idea of non-being. We give form to the formless. We make absence present. This paradox appears in the writings of Parmenides, who argued that what is not cannot be thought or spoken of, because to think of it is to make it be. If something truly does not exist, how can it have any properties, any name, any conceptual space in the mind? Yet we speak of fictional characters, impossible worlds, and even abstract nothingness with ease. We say things like, unicorns do not exist, or there is nothing in the box, and somehow those statements are meaningful. But if nothing is truly nothing, how can it be talked about? Here lies the paradox. Language and thought seem to require reference points, even when the thing being referenced is defined by its absence. Non-being becomes a kind of presence, a ghost of logic that exists in the negative space of what is. The more precisely we try to define non-existence, the more it behaves like existence. To deny something, we must first conceive it, and that conception gives it a strange sort of being. In metaphysics, this paradox challenges how we understand reality. Is nothing a real concept, or merely a linguistic illusion? In logic, it underlies deep questions about negation, absence, and contradiction. In theology and cosmology, it emerges in the idea of creation ex nihilo, something from nothing, and in death, where we try to imagine a state beyond perception, beyond time, beyond self. But even there, we are imagining, and thus imagining something. The paradox of non-being does not offer resolution, it offers a mirror. It reflects the limits of thought, the boundaries of language, and the mystery of how we frame the world through contrast. Perhaps non-being cannot truly be grasped, because it is not an object to be held, but a silence that defines the shape of every word. In that silence, we find a strange truth, that to speak of nothing is to say something, and in doing so, we prove that even absence has a presence, in the mind that dares to name it. The paradox of the non-conceptual. The paradox of the non-conceptual begins at the outer edge of thought, at the point where experience exceeds what the mind can name. It asks, can we ever be aware of something without having a concept for it? And if so, how can we recognize, remember, or speak of it afterward? To acknowledge the non-conceptual is to give it a place in thought, but the moment we do, haven't we already transformed it into something conceptual? This paradox appears most vividly in moments of pure perception or profound experience. When you gaze at a vast night sky and feel a sense of awe too deep for words, was that feeling conceptual or something beyond it? Or consider the experience of a newborn, encountering the world without names, without categories, without ideas. Is their perception a flood of raw, non-conceptual awareness? And if so, how do we know what that's like? If we can no longer return to that state without immediately trying to interpret it. Some philosophers, particularly in phenomenology and certain strands of Buddhism, argue that the non-conceptual is real and foundational, that we are always immersed in a flow of direct experience that concepts merely slice into manageable parts. Concepts help us navigate the world, but they also filter it. They make experience intelligible, but never total. Yet this leads to a quiet contradiction. In order to think about the non-conceptual, we must conceptualize it. We must shape it into a form the mind can hold. And in doing so, we lose the very thing we're trying to grasp. This is the heart of the paradox. To speak of the non-conceptual is to violate its nature, but to remain silent is to deny its existence. We are left hovering in between, aware of something that cannot be said, yet unwilling to pretend it's not there. The paradox also haunts art, mysticism, and deep emotional states. A painting moves us, not because of what it means, but because of something it reveals beyond meaning. A mystical vision defies explanation, but changes a life. The moment we try to describe it, the power slips through our fingers. And yet, the attempt to speak remains vital, like trying to trace the outline of a flame without extinguishing it. The paradox of the non-conceptual reminds us that language and thought, powerful as they are, do not encompass the full spectrum of being. There is always something just beyond the edge of the map, something we know, not by thinking, but by being. And in those rare moments when the mind goes quiet and the world simply is, we catch a glimpse of what thought cannot hold and what silence alone may honor. The binding problem paradox. The binding problem paradox sits quietly at the core of conscious experience, asking a question that seems so fundamental, it's almost invisible. How does the brain take all its fragmented sensory data and bind it into a unified, seamless experience? When you see a red apple, you don't perceive its color, shape, texture, and motion as separate events. You experience one thing, an apple. But behind the scenes, your brain is processing these features in separate regions, at different speeds, through entirely distinct neural pathways. So how is it all brought together into one coherent now? The paradox arises from this mismatch between the brain's distributed processing and the mind's unified awareness. Color is processed in one region, shape in another, motion in another, still. And yet, your conscious mind isn't aware of data streams. It experiences whole objects, complete, meaningful, and immediate. There's no flicker of delay or fragmentation, just experience. But how? Some neuroscientists suggest synchronization, timing mechanisms in the brain that align signals across regions. Others propose convergence zones, where different features are integrated. But none of these explanations resolve the deeper paradox. Even if the brain can combine data at a physical level, how does that feel like unity? Why isn't conscious experience fragmented, like watching dozens of disconnected screens? The binding problem becomes especially paradoxical when applied to self-awareness. You have countless thoughts, sensations, emotions, memories, all occurring in different layers of the brain. Yet you feel like a single self, an I to whom it all happens. How does that unity emerge from such multiplicity? It touches on the broader hard problem of consciousness, how physical processes give rise to subjective experience at all. But the binding problem adds a unique twist, not just why we're conscious, but how our consciousness feels like one thing, how the chaos becomes coherence, how the scattered becomes centered. The paradox quietly destabilizes the confidence we place in our perceptions. What we take as whole and obvious may be the result of a vast, delicate orchestration we don't understand. It reminds us that consciousness is not just miraculous in its existence, but in its organization. And so, the binding problem. Paradox leaves us with a humbling mystery. Who or what is tying it all together? If no part of the brain contains the full picture, then perhaps unity is not something found inside the system, but something emerging from it, like a symphony rising from scattered notes, a mind born from many voices, singing as one. The paradox of temporal parts. The paradox of temporal parts is a quiet fracture in how we think about identity through time. It asks, are we whole beings at each moment, or are we stretched across time like a series of segments, temporal parts, connected only by continuity? Imagine a person not as a singular, unchanging self, but as a sequence of time slices. You at 5, you at 15, you right now, you tomorrow. Each version of you is distinct, shaped by its moment, its thoughts, its body. So then, who are you really? This is the theory of perdurantism, which claims that objects and persons persist by having different temporal parts at different times, just as they have different spatial parts in space. In contrast, endurantism sees objects as wholly present at each moment in time. But here's where the paradox takes root. If you are a series of temporal parts, then no single version of you is the real you. You're a four-dimensional entity spread across time, and yet your experience feels like you are all here, fully present in this single moment. The paradox deepens when we consider personal responsibility and memory. If you at age 7 is a different temporal part than you at 30, can you be held accountable for that child's actions? If the self is nothing more than a chain of non-identical slices, what binds them into a continuous I? Is memory enough? Is continuity of intention? Or is the very idea of a persistent self an illusion we project across these parts? In metaphysics, this challenges our assumptions about what it means for anything to persist. If a chair exists across time by having different temporal parts, then at what point does it become a different chair? Is any object or person truly the same from one moment to the next? Or are we constantly replaced by versions of ourselves, flickering in and out of temporal focus? Some thinkers embrace this fragmentation. They argue that the self is a narrative, stitched together from momentary selves, each passing the torch to the next. Others resist, insisting on an enduring core that survives change. But the paradox remains. We feel like unified, consistent beings, even as everything within us is constantly shifting. The paradox of temporal parts invites us to rethink identity, not as permanence, but as process, an unfolding, a continuity not of substance, but of connection. It whispers that we are not who we once were, nor who we will be, but a becoming, moment by moment, stitched from time itself. The recombination paradox. The recombination paradox is a quiet riddle nestled deep within metaphysics, where possibility stretches reality to its breaking point. It begins with a simple and intuitive principle. Anything can coexist with anything. This is David Lewis's principle of recombination, the idea that any entity, quality, or feature that can exist somewhere can be recombined to exist together with any other in some possible world. If unicorns exist in one world and time travel in another, then there's a possible world where both exist together. If you can imagine it, reality could have been that way. But here's where the paradox creeps in. If recombination is limitless, then every possible world must be combinable with every other. But this leads to contradictions. What happens when two properties are mutually exclusive? Can a world contain both complete darkness and perfect light? Can a being be both omniscient and ignorant, immortal and mortal, present and absent at once? If recombination is truly unconstrained, then it allows for impossible combinations. And yet, by definition, impossible combinations cannot exist. The paradox deepens when applied to identity and individuation. Suppose you recombine all properties of a particular person, say their memories, body, temperament, with an entirely different setting, time, or soul? Is the resulting person still them? If every aspect of reality can be shuffled and reshaped, what anchors anything as distinct or meaningful? The very idea of identity begins to dissolve under the weight of infinite rearrangement. Some philosophers respond by limiting recombination. Not everything can coexist with everything else, but the moment you restrict it, you compromise its metaphysical power, the very thing that makes the principle attractive in the first place. Others attempt to draw boundaries around coherent recombinations, but then the paradox returns. Who decides what's coherent in a space defined by pure possibility? The recombination paradox doesn't deny imagination, it stretches it to its limits. It reveals that our intuitive sense of possibility, when left unrestricted, can give rise to incoherence. It shows that freedom in metaphysics, like in language, may need rules, not because reality is limited, but because even possibility needs structure. And so the paradox lingers between infinite creativity and logical consistency. It asks whether the world is a canvas where anything goes, or a space where some patterns, once broken, unravel the very idea of a possible world. It reminds us that while imagination is boundless, meaning may still require constraint. The Sleeping Judge Paradox. The Sleeping Judge Paradox reveals a subtle contradiction between procedural justice and conscious agency. Imagine a courtroom where a judge, respected, fair, and fully informed, falls asleep during a critical part of a trial. Despite the judge's absence of awareness, the trial proceeds according to law. The evidence is presented, the arguments are made, and the jury reaches a verdict. Everything is, on paper, procedurally correct. But when the judge later signs off on the outcome, a strange question arises. Is justice truly served when the one meant to oversee it is unaware of what occurred? Here's the paradox. We want our systems to be reliable, consistent, and governed by rules so that justice doesn't depend on the whims of individuals. But we also expect those in power, especially judges, to exercise active, conscious judgment. If the judge is asleep, even temporarily, can they still be said to have performed their role? If all outcomes remain legally valid, does awareness even matter? The contradiction lies in the dual role we expect judges to play. They are both procedural cogs in a legal machine and embodied agents of fairness. The paradox forces us to ask whether justice is a matter of process or presence. If all rules are followed, but the person tasked with watching over them is mentally absent, can we trust the verdict? And if the system functions without that awareness, do we truly need conscious oversight at all? Some may argue that so long as the trial meets formal standards, the judge's awareness is irrelevant. Others insist that without active engagement, the spirit of justice is lost because real justice requires interpretation, discernment, and responsiveness to nuance. A sleeping judge may fulfill the structure, but not the substance, of justice. The sleeping judge paradox mirrors larger questions about automation, responsibility, and the role of human consciousness in institutional systems. How much agency must we demand of decision makers? Can systems be just when their overseers are disengaged? And what do we lose when authority becomes symbolic rather than active? The paradox doesn't just raise doubts about courtroom procedure. It speaks to a deeper anxiety, that institutions can appear functional while their moral centers lie dormant. And it asks us to reflect not just on what decisions are made, but whether those making them are truly awake. The disjunctivist paradox. The disjunctivist paradox sits at the fragile boundary between perception and illusion. It asks a deceptively simple question. Is there a fundamental difference between seeing something real and merely seeming to see it? Disjunctivism says yes. When you see a tree, and the tree is really there, your experience is fundamentally different from a hallucination, even if both feel exactly the same to you. But this leads to a paradox. If the experiences are subjectively indistinguishable, how can they be metaphysically distinct? The core idea of disjunctivism is that perception is not one kind of internal experience shared between veridical, truthful perception and hallucination. Instead, it claims that veridical perception and hallucination are entirely different mental states. One puts you in direct contact with reality, the other does not. So even if a hallucination and a genuine perception feel the same, they are not the same kind of experience. They only appear similar from the inside. But here's where the paradox emerges. If two experiences are phenomenally indistinguishable, if from the first-person point of view they feel exactly alike, on what basis can we say they are categorically different? How can we draw a firm metaphysical line between them when subjective access, the only access we truly have to experience, gives us no way to tell them apart? This challenges the idea that experience is enough to justify knowledge. If the contents of your mind don't change when switching from seeing a real tree to hallucinating one, how can your belief about the tree be justified in one case but not the other? If disjunctivism is true, then much of what we think we know through perception might be radically less stable than it appears. We might constantly be on the edge of error, only saved by external facts we can't detect. The disjunctivist paradox thus exposes a rift between phenomenology, how things seem, and epistemology, what we can claim to know. If our mental life feels the same whether it aligns with reality or not, then how can we trust perception at all? Yet to collapse both into one kind of experience seems to erase the difference between contact with reality and illusion. The paradox leaves us with a haunting possibility, that we may never fully know when we are seeing the world and when we are merely seeing the possibility of it. And in that uncertainty lies a deeper philosophical challenge, not just to understand the nature of perception, but to grasp how we ever come to know anything at all. The paradox of lost content. The paradox of lost content emerges from the strange boundary between memory, meaning, and disappearance. It asks, what happens when you forget not just a fact, but that you ever knew it? If a thought, belief, or concept is completely erased from your mind, does it still count as part of your mental life? Or is it lost so fully that it was never truly yours? Imagine you once knew how to solve complex calculus problems, fluently spoke a language, or held a deep philosophical insight. But over time, due to disuse, trauma, or neural decay, that content slips away. Not just the details, but the awareness that it ever existed. You forget that you ever knew. Here lies the paradox. If you once possessed meaningful mental content, but now have no memory or trace of it, did you truly possess it in a lasting sense? Can content that no longer affects thought, behavior, or memory be said to belong to the mind? This paradox touches on a deeper metaphysical problem. What is the ontological status of mental content once it disappears? If memory is the only bridge between past cognition and current awareness, then lost content seems to vanish into nothingness. But that content once shaped you, your beliefs, your skills, even your personality. It played a role in the formation of who you are now. So is it truly gone? Or is it a hidden ghost in the structure of your mind? Philosophers and cognitive scientists debate whether lost content is simply inaccessible or fundamentally erased. Some argue that forgotten information still resides somewhere in the brain, just unretrievable. Others say that once content becomes permanently inaccessible, it ceases to be part of the mind. Yet both views struggle with the same paradox. If we measure content by its influence or retrievability, how do we account for the invisible residue it leaves behind? The paradox of lost content also raises questions about selfhood and identity. If entire chapters of your knowledge and experience disappear, who are you now in relation to who you were? Are you still the same person if the contents of your mind have changed completely? If meaning was once present but now unrecoverable, did it really ever belong to you, or has it become a kind of phantom knowledge? Ultimately, this paradox doesn't just ask what we know, it asks what happens when what we knew disappears without a trace. And in that vanishing, we are reminded that the mind is not only a space of presence, but of absence, a place where what is forgotten still quietly shapes what remains. The puzzle of the many. The puzzle of the many is a quiet storm within metaphysics, a paradox that forces us to confront how we define boundaries, identity, and the very idea of one thing. Imagine a cloud. You look up and see it floating in the sky, and you think, there's a cloud. But now consider that a cloud is made of countless water droplets. Around the edge, there are droplets that may or may not belong to the cloud. Remove one droplet, and it still looks like the same cloud. Remove another, still the same. But continue doing this, and eventually you no longer have the cloud you started with. Now flip the scenario. Start with a core group of droplets you're sure form the cloud. Add another droplet nearby. It doesn't seem to change much, surely it belongs too. Keep adding. But where does the cloud end? There seems to be no precise cutoff between part of the cloud and not part of the cloud. So here's the paradox. Which exact collection of droplets is the cloud? And if many slightly different collections all qualify, are there many clouds in the same place? This is the essence of the puzzle of the many. For any object that has vague boundaries, a cloud, a mountain, a person, there are countless overlapping candidates for what the object is. Each is slightly different, yet indistinguishable in practice. So, which one is the real one? Are there millions of nearly identical clouds coexisting? If not, why does this set of droplets make the cut while another, just slightly different, does not? The paradox was first articulated by philosopher Peter Unger and applies not just to clouds, but to anything fuzzy-edged, like a pile of sand, a crowd, or even your body. You shed skin cells constantly. Are you the person with or without them? Are there multiple overlapping versions of you with subtly different boundaries, all existing simultaneously? Philosophers have responded in various ways. Some accept a form of vague identity, suggesting that objects can be real even without precise boundaries. Others propose supervaluationism, where many precise candidates exist, but we refer to them collectively as one thing. And some embrace the unsettling idea that many objects really do exist in the same space, nearly identical, yet numerically distinct. The puzzle of the many doesn't undermine our ability to see the world. It reveals how fragile our categories really are. It reminds us that identity is not always clean, that boundaries are often blurred, and that our sense of one thing may quietly contain many. In a world of gradients and ambiguity, the puzzle leaves us with a deeper humility. Perhaps the unity we see in things is not a feature of the world, but a creation of the mind seeking clarity in a reality full of indistinction. The substitution paradox. The substitution paradox arises from a subtle tension between meaning, identity, and knowledge, especially in contexts where language refers to the same thing under different names. At first glance, substitution seems simple. If two terms refer to the same entity, then one should be replaceable by the other without changing the truth of a statement. But here lies the paradox. Sometimes substitution preserves truth, but not meaning. Or worse, it seems to distort understanding entirely. Consider this classic example from the philosophy of language. Lois Lane believes that Superman can fly. Superman is Clark Kent. Therefore, Lois Lane believes that Clark Kent can fly. Logically, this seems valid. Superman is Clark Kent. But intuitively, the conclusion feels false. Lois Lane doesn't believe Clark Kent can fly. She sees him as a mild-mannered reporter, not a superhero. The paradox emerges because substituting co-referential terms, two names that refer to the same individual, alters the truth value of belief statements, even when the identity relation holds. This challenges the idea that identity is always transparent through substitution. Philosophers call this the problem of opacity in propositional attitudes, contexts where someone's belief, desire, or knowledge involves how something is presented, not just what it refers to. In these cases, reference alone doesn't capture meaning. Even if Superman and Clark Kent are the same person in the world, they are not the same person to Lois. This paradox doesn't just live in comic books. It affects how we think about knowledge, reference, and understanding. You might believe that the morning star is visible at dawn and not realize it's the same as the evening star. So you might reject the belief that the evening star is visible at dawn, despite referring to the same object, Venus. Again, substitution fails to preserve belief. The substitution paradox reveals a deeper truth, that what we know is not just what something is, but how it is conceived. Identity in the world may be stable, but identity in the mind is shaped by context, labels, and layers of meaning. The paradox exposes the limits of pure logic when applied to human cognition, where names carry weight, histories, and emotional significance. The substitution paradox reminds us that meaning isn't just a matter of reference, it's a matter of perspective. And in a world where language shapes thought, and thought shapes truth, not all equivalences are interchangeable, even when they point to the very same thing. The first-person authority paradox. The first-person authority paradox explores one of the strangest features of conscious experience, that we seem to have a special kind of access to our own minds, more direct, more certain, more privileged than anyone else possibly could. If you say, "I am in pain," or "I believe it will rain tomorrow," there's something self-verifying in those statements. You don't need to observe yourself from the outside. You don't need evidence. You just know. And most of the time, we all take this for granted. But here lies the paradox. How can self-knowledge be both infallible and fallible? How can we claim authority over our own mental states when psychology and neuroscience repeatedly show that we're often wrong about what we feel, think, or want? People deny their own emotions. They act on beliefs they don't realize they have. They even report intentions that contradict their behavior. So which is it? Do we know ourselves better than anyone, or are we unreliable narrators of our inner world? This tension creates a paradox of trust. If first-person statements are immune to correction, because only you can report your thoughts and feelings, then we risk sealing ourselves inside bubbles of self-delusion. But if we allow others to challenge our self-knowledge based on their observations, behavior patterns, or hidden cues, then we undermine the very idea of first-person authority. Imagine someone saying, "I'm not angry," while clenching their fists and speaking through gritted teeth. From the outside, the signs are clear, but from within, they might truly believe what they say. Are they wrong about their own mind? Or is anger present in a way they haven't consciously grasped? The paradox forces us to ask whether awareness always follows experience, or if sometimes others can see what we cannot. Philosophers attempt to resolve the paradox by distinguishing transparent mental states, like "I believe it's raining," from opaque emotional states, like "I'm in love" or "I'm anxious," where interpretation and self-reflection play a greater role. But even here, the boundaries blur. Sometimes we don't know what we think until we say it. Sometimes we feel something deeply but can't find the words. The first-person authority paradox reminds us that the mind is both window and mirror. We look out through it at the world and inward through it at ourselves, but neither view is perfectly clear. We are both the closest and farthest from understanding our own minds. And in that mystery, we discover that being ourselves is not a fixed position, but an ongoing exploration where certainty and confusion live side by side. The reference paradox. The reference paradox strikes at the heart of language and meaning, asking, how can we refer to something that doesn't exist? When we talk about unicorns, Sherlock Holmes, or the square root of a negative tree, our words seem to mean something. We can describe them, debate them, and even build fictional worlds around them. But if these things don't exist, then what exactly are we referring to? At the center of this paradox is a tension between semantic intention and ontological absence. In ordinary speech, we assume that reference connects words to things. Paris refers to a city. Water refers to H2O. But what about Pegasus? There is no actual winged horse flying through the skies, yet we talk about Pegasus as if there were. We can say Pegasus has wings and consider it true within a myth. So how can something that isn't real be the subject of real statements? Some philosophers argue that such names don't refer at all. They're empty. But if that were true, how could we meaningfully distinguish between Pegasus has wings and Pegasus has wheels? Both would be equally meaningless. Yet clearly, one sounds more coherent within the fiction. Others propose that we refer not to objects, but to concepts, descriptions, or mental constructs. But then we face another twist. If we can only refer to what exists in some form, how do we even formulate the idea of non-existence? This leads to the paradoxical implication that in order to deny the existence of something, we must first refer to it. To say, the Golden Mountain does not exist, we must have already mentally constructed the Golden Mountain. So we are forced to refer in order to deny. But how can we refer to what has no being? Bertrand Russell attempted to resolve this with his theory of descriptions, suggesting that phrases like the present King of France don't name anything, but rather express a claim that fails. Still, this shifts rather than solves the puzzle, because our minds continue to interact with these absent figures, treating them as if they could be real. The reference paradox quietly challenges our grip on meaning. It shows that language is not just a mirror of reality, it's a tool for constructing realities, even ones that don't exist. And in doing so, it opens a strange philosophical space, where we speak meaningfully of the unreal, refer without anchor, and discover that absence can be as thinkable and sometimes as powerful as presence. The paradox of deference. The paradox of deference is a quiet fracture in our confidence about knowledge and authority. It asks, if we rely on others for knowledge, how do we know what we ourselves believe? In a world filled with experts, scientists, scholars, doctors, we often defer to those who know more. You might believe Pluto is not a planet because astronomers say so. You might believe a medication works because your doctor says it does. But if your belief is entirely based on trusting someone else, do you really believe it? Or are you just repeating? The paradox deepens when you ask yourself, where is the line between belief and echo? If you say water is H2O because chemists say it is, do you actually understand what that means? Or are you outsourcing your belief? Deference helps us navigate a complex world, but it introduces a strange disconnect. Your beliefs may not be your own in any deep sense. They live in the space between trust and understanding. This becomes even more tangled in moral or philosophical domains. Imagine someone who says, I believe stealing is wrong because my religious leader says so. Do they really believe stealing is wrong? Or are they merely submitting to an authority? Can belief exist without inner justification, or does true belief require ownership? Philosopher Tyler Burge introduced this puzzle to highlight how much of our knowledge depends on social structures. We defer to dictionaries for word meanings, to doctors for health, to physicists for time. But then the paradox turns inward. If knowledge can be socially distributed, can belief be truly individual? If your views are shaped by trust in others, what part of them is you? In an age of overwhelming information, the paradox only grows. We rely on search engines, algorithms, and experts, but each act of deference makes us question, am I knowing or am I following? The more we depend on others, the harder it becomes to trace our beliefs back to personal understanding. The paradox of deference leaves us with a subtle unease. It asks whether we truly believe what we say we believe, or whether our convictions are borrowed, floating, provisional, held not by reflection, but by faith in others. The paradox of transparency. The paradox of transparency asks a quietly unsettling question about self-awareness. If our experiences are so vivid, why do we struggle to see ourselves clearly? It begins with the idea that consciousness, especially when reflecting inward, is transparent. When you try to examine your own thoughts or feelings, what you notice is not the experience itself, but the thing the experience is about. Try to reflect on your belief that it's raining. You don't find the belief, you look outward at the rain. Your mind becomes a window, not a mirror. This is what philosophers call transparency. When you introspect, you don't observe your mental state directly, you observe the world through it. So when you ask, do I believe it's raining? You check the sky. When you ask, am I sad? You might think about what happened today, but this creates a strange contradiction. The very act of looking inward redirects you outward. So how can we ever truly access our own mind? This is the heart of the paradox of transparency. Introspection seems to confirm that we're aware of our mental states, but the process itself hides those states behind their content. You don't see your sadness, you see the loss that caused it. You don't notice your belief, you notice what it's about. This leads to the unsettling conclusion that the more you try to observe your inner life, the more you may overlook it entirely. The paradox grows more troubling when applied to self-knowledge. We often assume that we know ourselves best, that we have privileged access to our thoughts and feelings. But transparency suggests that much of what we think we're aware of is inferred from outside cues. You don't always know you're angry until you hear your voice shake. You don't realize you're anxious until you notice your restlessness. If mental states are only seen through their objects, then our minds might be more opaque than we think. Some philosophers embrace this paradox, suggesting that self-knowledge is a kind of interpretation rather than direct observation. Others push back, insisting that we do have special access to our minds, just not the way we thought. Either way, the transparency of experience reveals a deep tension between immediacy and self-understanding. The paradox of transparency doesn't claim we are strangers to ourselves. It suggests that we are always looking through ourselves. And in that subtle act of looking outward, we lose the very thing we set out to find. Like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror, introspection gives you everything except itself. The paradox of the immaterial observer. The paradox of the immaterial observer drifts at the boundary of consciousness, perception, and substance, asking a haunting question. If the self has no material form, how does it observe the physical world? In nearly every conscious experience, there seems to be a witness behind the thoughts, a silent observer who watches the world unfold. But when we look for this observer, we find no object, no neuron, no particle that seems to match the role. The observer is always present, yet nowhere to be found. Many philosophical traditions and introspective practices describe consciousness as an open field, a space in which thoughts, feelings, and perceptions arise. But this space, this awareness, appears to have no weight, no texture, no definable structure. You cannot touch it. You cannot measure it. And yet, it is the most intimate and certain thing we know. From this comes the paradox. How can something immaterial interact with, observe, and seemingly be affected by the material world without itself being material? If you see a tree, photons strike your retina, neural signals fire, and your brain processes the information. But who, or what, is actually seeing the tree? Science can describe the processing of data, but not the experience itself. The observer feels separate from the mechanisms. This separation births the paradox. If the observer is immaterial, how can it receive input from the material world? And if it is material, why can't we locate it like we locate a liver or a lung? Some theories, like Cartesian dualism, posit a non-physical mind interacting with a physical body. But this leads to an explanatory problem. How can something that lacks physical properties cause changes in physical matter, or be changed by it? Others, like materialist neuroscience, claim the observer is simply an illusion created by brain processes. But this too feels incomplete, because even if the self is an illusion, it is still being experienced, and that experience resists reduction. The paradox also echoes through spiritual and contemplative traditions. Meditators often report that when the mind becomes still, the sense of being a separate self dissolves, and what remains is pure witnessing, a presence with no boundaries. This seems to confirm the paradox. The observer is not a thing, but the condition for things to appear at all. Ultimately, the paradox of the immaterial observer challenges our understanding of what it means to be conscious. It suggests that the self might not be something within the world, but the very space in which the world is revealed. Not a player on the stage, but the light by which the stage is seen. And in that mystery, the line between inner and outer, subject and object, real and unreal begins to blur, leaving behind only the quiet awareness that observes it all. The mirror paradox of self-awareness. The mirror paradox of self-awareness captures a haunting truth at the core of consciousness. To see yourself, you must first become a stranger. Just as a mirror reflects your body from the outside, self-awareness reflects your mind from a strange distance. But how can the self both observe and be the one observed? How can the subject become its own object? This is the paradox. To be aware of yourself, you must somehow split in two while remaining one. When you become self-aware, truly conscious of your thoughts, your identity, your presence, it feels like stepping outside of yourself to observe what is within. You say, "I'm thinking this," or "I feel that," as if there's a watcher behind the thinker. But who is watching? And who is being watched? The more you look inward, the more you notice this doubling. The self becomes both the mirror and the reflection, the actor and the audience, the one thinking and the one noticing the thought. This recursive loop forms the core of the mirror paradox. Every time you try to pin down who or what the self is, it slips behind another layer of observation. Ask yourself, "Who am I?" And an answer may appear. But then you ask, who is asking that question? And the self seems to vanish behind its own inquiry. Each act of reflection gives you a surface, never the source. Psychologists and philosophers alike have wrestled with this split. In cognitive science, self-awareness is treated as a higher-order process, thoughts about thoughts. But in phenomenology and existential philosophy, it is seen as a deeper rupture. Consciousness can never fully coincide with itself. It always reaches for itself, as if looking into a mirror, unable to merge with what it sees. And just like a mirror reverses the image, self-awareness can distort. We never see ourselves directly. We interpret, judge, and reconstruct. We may feel seen, yet still unknown. The more we reflect, the more we project. We may chase self-knowledge, only to find a reflection shaped by desire, fear, or illusion. The observer cannot step outside the mirror it uses to see. The mirror paradox of self-awareness reveals that our sense of I may not be a fixed point, but an echo, bouncing between perception and reflection, caught in an infinite regress. To be self-aware is to be split, doubled, reflected, and refracted. And yet, paradoxically, this fractured awareness is the very heart of what it means to be conscious. It is not a flaw in our nature, but the mystery that defines it. The identity over time paradox. The identity over time paradox confronts a quiet question that haunts every life. How can you be the same person you were 10 years ago when so much has changed? Our bodies evolve, our memories fade, our beliefs shift, and yet we say, "That was me." But how much can change before the me becomes someone else? This is the heart of the paradox. We remain the same person while becoming someone new. At birth, we are small, speechless, and unaware. As we grow, we acquire language, preferences, pain, joy, and memories that shape who we are. By adulthood, almost every cell in our body has been replaced. We think differently, feel differently, act differently. Yet through all of this, we carry the unshakable conviction of continuous selfhood. I am still me. Philosophers have wrestled with this paradox for centuries. The ancient ship of Theseus thought experiment captures it well. If every plank of a ship is replaced over time, is it still the same ship? And if so, what makes it the same? Apply this to yourself. Every memory altered, every opinion updated, every cell renewed. What remains? Some argue that identity is rooted in memory. You are who you remember being. But memory is notoriously unreliable. We forget, we distort, we rewrite. Others propose psychological continuity. If your beliefs, intentions, and personality evolve in a connected way, you're still you. But this too raises questions. How gradual can the change be before you're no longer the same? The paradox deepens in moments of trauma, transformation, or loss. A person who survives a major life event, like a near-death experience or profound psychological shift, may emerge feeling like someone else entirely. Yet legally, socially, and often even spiritually, they are treated as the same individual. Is identity just a convenient label to track continuity? Or is it something real, an unchanging core beneath the flux? Some traditions, especially in Eastern philosophy, dissolve the paradox entirely. They suggest there is no fixed self, only a stream of experiences loosely connected by habit and memory. The self is like a flame, constant in appearance, but always changing in substance. The identity over time paradox doesn't offer easy answers. It sits quietly at the center of every biography, every photo album, every old letter or childhood drawing. It whispers that the person you used to be is both gone and still here. That time doesn't erase you, but it doesn't preserve you either. And in that tension, you discover a strange truth. Identity is not a fixed point in time. It is a story told across time, fragile, fluid, and always becoming. The binding paradox in perception. The binding paradox in perception is a quiet riddle buried inside every moment of conscious experience. It asks, how does the brain unify a world that arrives in pieces? When you look around, you see colors, shapes, motion, and depth seamlessly integrated into a coherent scene. You hear sounds, feel textures, and smell scents, all aligned with what you see. Yet neuroscience tells us these features are processed in different regions of the brain, at different times, by different mechanisms. So how does the mind bind them together into a single, unified experience? This is the paradox. If perception is fragmented at its origin, where and how does the unity emerge? Light hits your retina and travels through a complex neural pipeline. Color in one area, edges in another, motion elsewhere. Sound goes through its own pathway, touch through another. There is no central theater in the brain where it all comes together. No homunculus watching the show. And yet your experience feels whole, immediate, and integrated. The paradox intensifies when you realize that the timing doesn't even match up. Color and motion are processed at different speeds. Sound can lag behind sight, yet you perceive them as perfectly synchronized. You see a dog bark and hear the bark in the same instant, though the brain processed each in separate systems, potentially milliseconds apart. Somehow, your mind corrects for this. Or maybe it edits the timeline after the fact, creating a smooth illusion of simultaneity. Cognitive scientists have proposed several theories. Some argue for neural synchrony, the idea that groups of neurons firing together might explain how features get linked. Others point to attention as the glue, suggesting that what we focus on becomes bound together by the spotlight of awareness. But none of these fully solve the puzzle, because for all our neural mappings and theories, we still cannot explain how the parts become a whole. The experience of now still emerges from chaos. The binding paradox challenges the very foundation of perception. It whispers that what you see might not be what's really there, but a reconstruction. That your mind isn't passively receiving the world, it's actively assembling it, stitching together fragments into a seamless illusion of continuity. And the most unsettling part, it does all this without a central you in charge. The unity you feel may be real, but the one who feels it might not be as singular as you think. The binding paradox reminds us that the world you experience is not simply out there, it's also in here, woven from sparks of sensory input, illusions of time, and the mysterious thread of consciousness that somehow makes it all feel like one. The supervenience paradox. The supervenience paradox quietly unravels the link between the mental and the physical, asking a deceptively simple question: how can thoughts depend on matter without being reducible to it? In philosophy of mind, supervenience is the idea that mental states depend on physical states. That is, there can be no change in your thoughts, emotions, or consciousness without some underlying change in your physical brain. But here lies the paradox. If every mental change is tied to a physical change, then what makes the mental truly distinct? And if it's not distinct, why do we treat the mental as real at all? To say the mental supervenes on the physical is to admit a kind of dependency without identity. Your pain depends on neurons firing in your brain, but pain isn't just a pattern of neurons. It's also a feeling, raw, subjective, undeniable. But if two identical physical systems must have identical mental states, then the mental seems to be locked in by the physical. There's no room for mental autonomy, no wiggle room for consciousness to be its own thing. Yet at the same time, we feel that mental states matter in a different way. You don't just act because molecules push you, you act because you believe, desire, intend. And these aren't just brain states, they are meaningful experiences. So the paradox grows. How can the mental be both entirely dependent on the physical and yet seem to carry irreducible meaning? If we reduce beliefs to brain chemistry, do they stop being about anything? This leads to strange consequences. Imagine two people with identical brains. If their physical states are the same, then their thoughts must be too. But what if they grew up in different cultures, spoke different languages, loved different people? Can meaning truly be encoded in matter so precisely? Or is something being left out? The supervenience paradox forces us into a corner. Either the mental is entirely explainable in physical terms, which makes consciousness feel like a hollow echo of biology, or there is something more, something non-physical that science cannot grasp, which breaks the laws of dependency. Either way, our current frameworks struggle. This paradox doesn't deny the connection between mind and body, it highlights its uncanny intimacy. That our most private, meaningful, subjective experiences are somehow stitched into the fabric of biology. And that even though every thought may rest on atoms, those atoms do not feel what we feel. The paradox remains, not to be solved, but to be witnessed. A silent reminder that beneath every neuron firing is the echo of a thought asking, but who is thinking this, and why does it matter?